back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Vance, joined as always by Dmitri Calhoun here with a huge World War III update. It is Friday, July 17th as we are recording this, and the Memorandum of Understanding has been collapsed for over a week now, and the shelling and the strikes and the warfare is escalating. I can anticipate us this coming week getting into levels of warfare and strikes and intensity that will be rivaling and outperforming what was happening earlier in the year in March and April before the ceasefire and the Memorandum of Understanding came about. So everybody needs to pray and prepare for all of that. America has struck the infrastructure, civilian, and energy production within Iran. Iran is likely to respond in kind this weekend and going into next week. America is currently resupplying their tankers and their fighters. F-16s are being dragged en masse to Israel and to other American bases in the region. The U.S. blockade against the Persian Gulf and against all Iranian ports has been reinstated as of, I believe it was Tuesday or Wednesday of this past week. So everything about the Memorandum of Understanding negotiated supposedly by, J.D. Vance and Ghalibaf and Pezeshkian and Araghchi, that is completely collapsed. We have a lot of recent quotes from Iranian sources about how there will no longer be a tit-for-tat level of fighting or retaliation as the motivation. We're entering sort of total war. Again, they said that if civilian infrastructure was struck, all infrastructure in the region will be taken out. So that is what we are anticipating now going into the weekend and going into next week. So it's going to be a very, very eventful few days here. This could be the big one. That was the title of my stream this past week on our YouTube channel. This could be the big one. So everybody needs to sort of batten down the hatches and make sure that your, sort of disaster contingency plans are in place, because we can anticipate some fuel shortages. I have a lot to talk about. Abbott has been openly sort of prophesying and predicting these sorts of things, how in the next 7 to 8 weeks here in the United States we'll be experiencing food shortages and there will be civil unrest resulting from that. So we're going to talk about that and several other prophecies that are going to actually likely be fulfilled this week based on the timelines we have been given by the saints, including July 23rd, the opening and completion of a major section of the E65 highway, which is a major marker for a lot of these prophesied events. The Feast of St. Elias this year has been something that the saints have warned us about, among a whole host of other major developments that we're going to discuss throughout the course of this episode. So stay tuned and prepare for all of that. Things in Lebanon are obviously escalating as well. Israel is refusing to pull out. And the Black Sea is becoming more and more of a war zone as both Ukraine and Russia strike commercial shipping of grain and energy to the point now where Turkey is backing up Ukraine and saying they will join their regime, I guess, upon the resumption of peacetime, exporting goods and monitoring them on the Black Sea itself. So that, of course, has major implications for those of you that are keeping up with the prophecies. So we're going to dive into all of that. And before we do, I want to make sure everybody checks out our Substack at worldwarnow.co. Check out our latest Ether Hour episode this week with Dr. David Patrick Harry. We discuss World War III, the prophecies in the context of transhumanism, the new ID cards, which St. Paisios prophesied, and how, the powers that be, the world order, Zog, is moving us towards the satanic, demonic, transhumanist, biological bodies sort of world that very much has to do with the Antichrist and the mark of the beast and the rejection entirely of Christianity and Orthodoxy. So check that episode out. Dr. Patrick Harry is really a fantastic guest. He has us on his show all the time to talk about World War III and the prophecy. So he really knows his stuff when it comes to all of that. So that'll be linked down below. Check that out, as well as, hundreds of other episodes at worldwarnow.co behind the paywall at Ether Hour, including episodes with former Defense Minister of Lebanon, Yaqub Saraf, episode with Mike Painovich and Warren Baylog, all about geopolitics, episodes with Father Peter Hears, Gregory Hears, all about, again, World War III, the prophecies, and Orthodox history, Byzantine history. So many incredible episodes. So get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co to check all of that out. I want to encourage everybody to go to antelopehillpublishing.com as well and use code WWN for 10% off. They have some new releases all about Hitler and Stalin's war, World War II, the Soviet Union, and Nazi Germany's battles there. Some very interesting stuff. They have, of course, Culture of Critique in its 3rd edition by Kevin MacDonald. So check all of that out. And again, use code WWN for 10% off at antelopehillpublishing.com. If you want to support the show and you're already behind the paywall, or you only want to make a one-time payment, visit the Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/World War Now. We're making sure to thank every supporter on there whenever you make a donation to support the cause, because right now, the shadow banning and the other censorship we're experiencing is limiting our reach and growth and even shrinking it in some capacities. So really the support there is very much helpful. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Whether you're listening to this on YouTube or Substack, like the episode. Very, very important, very, very helpful. Leave a comment. Let us know what you thought of this week's World War III analysis. Be sure to follow us on X at @WorldWarNow_. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. Follow us on Telegram as well at World War Now Telly. These are all of our major sources that everyone needs to be checking out. So Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well, you can find us there. So send this to anybody that you think would be interested in this geopolitical analysis on their favorite platform so they don't have an excuse not to listen. And if you're already a supporter or you're thinking of becoming a supporter and you want to help us out even more than the ways we mentioned, gifting subscribers to your friends that you think would be interested is one of the best things to do because it adds people to the audience. It grows us on the Substack leaderboards. And of course it does obviously financially support. So consider doing all of that at worldwarnow.co. But huge amounts of things to talk about this week. Again, Dmitri, this show will be our last one sort of before the completion of the E65 highway, before the Feast of St. Elias, before a lot of these markers that the saints have sort of warned us about as far as big things to come. Of course, we're obviously still awaiting the fall of Erdogan, but as far as the war in Iran goes, I think the genie is now sort of incapable of being put back in the bottle with these new U.S. infrastructure strikes. The new statements from the Iranians are very harsh. We're about to see if they really mean what they say. But what are your thoughts in the midst of all of this? How intense is this about to get?
Yes, Conrad, it's been incredibly intense. This particular week, I would say, was the true reignition. And I cannot say, and our listeners, of course, can confirm that we were surprised that the events obviously prophesied as far back as 250 years ago, around the time America was founded by St. Cosmos of Aetolia, the hero martyr of the Greek people, and the other Greek as well as Russian elders who foretold about a coming war in the Middle East and a greater third world war. In that particular context, all of those events essentially will need to commence and transpire in these exact particular regions. And unfortunately, it does seem like both Donald J. Trump, those beneath him, and obviously those above him were completely at least planning to reinstate the status quo over the Middle East, which is, again, endless warfare, a taking of territory. Again, a war, I would say, and we'll analyze this later, mostly based, I think, on conquest, the taking of land, and almost like the British when they seized the Gibraltar, we'll see the Straits of Hormuz and possibly even the Bab-el-Mandeb Straits definitely seized and controlled by essentially Zog and the globalists. And I think there'll be a lot of powers essentially vying to not allow that to happen. And this, of course, will spill over. The greater Middle East, again, will be suffering for many years more. And sadly, Conrad, this week has just proven that diplomacy really takes a backseat to open outright warfare, and this is unfortunately the situation we're in today.
No, it's very true. I'm sorry for not asking you how you're doing. Things are just so intense that we're almost throwing aside the pleasantries and just diving right in to the analysis here. But I hope you're doing well. Obviously, we've been talking for several hours off stream, so of course I know you're already doing well. But for the audience, don't worry, I'm not forgetting, to ask our boy how he's doing. But of course, it's again, we have to wonder if this is a continuation of the Purim War. At this point, the strikes are likely to reach a new level of intensity. Trump is talking about taking out Pickaxe Mountain. There have been, I believe, 8 bridges that have been taken out across Iran. I'm going to get into the details on that here in 1 second. But again, as the prophecies say, it will sort of be a stopping and a starting of these wars very sort of suddenly and then sort of not so suddenly. And then eventually things are just going again. And I think the stoppages and the startages are getting, closer together and more shorter in time, and then the fighting is getting more intense. We remember, of course, last year we had the 12-day war where the prophecies of Elder Theodore Aghiopharangides were fulfilled when the Jews struck Iran's nuclear facilities, and then the Americans followed suit, which of course fulfilled the prophecies of Elder Joseph of Vatopedi and of St. Paisios, who talked about those things. And then, of course, now we have the Purim War, which began on the eve of Purim, of course, with the Jews commemorating the slaughter of the Persians in their tradition that effectively stopped in April and May with the Memorandum of Understanding. At least Trump is making sure that Congress thinks so, because he says that the 60-day deadline for needing congressional approval, he can fight these battles for 60 days before needing Congress to approve it with the War Powers Act. He's claiming the 60 days is now reset because the Memorandum of Understanding has since collapsed. So the Purim War has ended. We wonder, what is this stage called? Well, it effectively restarted on July 12th, the Feast of St. Paisios. And as it seems that this could really be the big one, as it were, that leads to a lot of these fateful events with the fall of Erdogan and eventually the retaking of Constantinople by Russia, the fall of Turkey, and all of these incredible events that, again, St. Paisios did tell people that were alive in the 90s that they would live to see these things. So I know that's a bit timeline heavy, and it's almost akin to saying dates, but he said it, so we're not gonna not say it here on the show. But is this new stage? Could we call it the Paisios War, the 12-day war, then the Purim War? Is this perhaps the Paisios War? Not because St. Paisios, of course, loved war. He hated war more than anyone, as he fought in a war himself, and of course didn't kill anybody. He was a radio operator, but he didn't rejoice in war in any capacity. But he knew that these things would happen, and he prophesied them, and we are living through them right now. So these hostilities resumed basically on the feast of St. Paisios. So perhaps that is a bit of an omen of how consequential these things are that are going to come here. So as far as the actual events go, the U.S. strikes on civilian infrastructure in Iran. This is from antiwar.com here. It says President Trump ordered strikes against civilian infrastructure in Iran, including bridges, roads, railways, and energy sites. Overnight Thursday, the U.S. bombed multiple bridges, a railway, a maritime watchtower, and energy sites. The U.S. strikes killed at least 8 Iranians. For months, President Trump has threatened to bomb civilian sites in Iran if Tehran did not comply with his demands. Iran has refused to make concessions to Washington and is attempting to end the conflict on its terms. Iran responded to the attacks by bombing U.S. bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. Tehran also targeted energy sites in Bahrain and a desalination plant in Kuwait. The IRGC claims to have taken out multiple U.S. radar systems and other military equipment. U.S. Central Command claims no U.S. troops were killed by the Iranian strikes. However, we do know that several were injured. That was reported by CBS. The ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran, established by the Memorandum of Understanding, collapsed last week after Iranian forces fired on vessels attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz in response to U.S. violations of the MOU. The U.S. responded by bombing Iran. Tehran retaliated with strikes on American bases in the region. The strikes have escalated over the past week. President Trump appears to be preparing for a more intense bombing campaign in Iran. On Friday, Axios reported speaking with 3 U.S. and Israeli officials who explained that the U.S. was moving additional refueling aircraft to Israel. The U.S. currently has about 60 refueling aircraft in Israel and plans to deploy several dozen more. Additionally, the sources said the president is considering a massive offensive against Iran. Of course, Hormuzgan Province's deputy director for political security and social affairs in Iran reported that several U.S. missiles struck electrical facilities and water desalination pumps in Banji, a village in coastal southern Iran. As a result, water has been cut off for several villages in western Jas County. So you combine that with what I believe is now the 8 bridges that were destroyed across Iran, mostly around Bandar Abbas. They're trying to sort of isolate that city. Almost all of these strikes on Iran by the U.S. have been on coastal Iran. There was one strike in central Iran at a missile silo there, but almost all of them have been across the entire coast. Keshem Island, Karg Island has been struck now, Kish Island, Sirak Island, all these other places, Jask, these are the places that are coming under fire. Charbahar Port is coming under heavy fire. Of course, that is the only Iranian port that exists outside of, or rather to the east of the Strait of Hormuz, outside of the strait, to the point where when the strait is closed, it can still safely pass through, even if mines have been laid and whatnot. Of course, it still falls privy to the U.S. blockade that has been started. So the bridges, again, that have been targeted included the Giriveh Bridge, the Latidan Village Bridge, the Kurdistan Law Route Bridges, Kishar Bridge, and the Maru Village Bridge, several around Bandar Abbas, and several in other regions across Iran. So Dmitri, I'd love your thoughts on these recent strikes. Of course, Iran has already responded in kind on Kuwait, and if their statements are to be taken seriously, like their statement from Khatam al-Anbiya's IRGC Central Command that says if the U.S. dares to target Iranian infrastructure, we will destroy every last piece of infrastructure in the entire region as if it never existed. What are you expecting to see this coming week from Iran? Of course, Trump is also threatening strikes against Pickaxe Mountain. So how do you expect both of these sides to escalate in the coming days?
It's been very interesting. This past, 6 days to a week of bombing has really shown a certain pattern in the U.S.'s targeting of U.S. Of U.S. key strategic interests in the south of Iran, specifically around the Straits of Hormuz. Almost as if it's not that the U.S. is trying to, openly destroy at least in the initial stages, to destroy Iran's capabilities to essentially shut down the strait, but they're trying to isolate almost the entirety of the coastal south of Iran, as well as the southeastern portion of Iran, which of course Chabahar, that port, that maritime watchtower, which was probably the only watchtower of its kind located in the southeast of Iran, which again, there's some quite striking images of that watchtower collapsing after several waves of U.S. bombing. It's really clear that the U.S. is trying to isolate and essentially leave those Iranian maritime groups or those coastal groups that, the remnants of the Iranian Navy that have been attempting to close the Straits of Hormuz, or at least keep that Iranian leverage alive, for those groups to be isolated entirely from the rest of the country, and for the Iranian military, for the IRGC to not be able to resupply them, at least not through traditional highways. For example, the Road 96 or the Road 71 from Tehran to Bandar Abbas, all those roads are being hit. And again, it's a similar pattern to what perhaps the Ukrainians were doing against the Russian Federation with those major highways and freeways leading to Crimea, essentially trying to isolate Russian logistics and eventually make it almost incredibly hazardous for both civilian and military usage, and for those essentially reinforcements to reach these particular key areas. Now, look, the fear that this creates, I think, within Iranian society and among Iranian decision makers is that the U.S., it appears, is softening the south of Iran, those coastal regions around and the islands themselves, in order to, again, accomplish some sort of amphibian or an airborne operation to, again, seize Iranian cities or key locations and, again, to hold them for their own means. And most likely it'll be a joint operation now that the GCC states, and we'll talk about that in a moment, have will and truly become involved in this conflict, and most likely will not be backing down on, will not be seeking, for example, separate ceasefire deals with Iran, and obviously they're not interested in actually expelling the American bases on their territories. Most likely the future coming joint operations around the Straits of Hormuz in the south of Iran will be involving those Arab Sunni Muslim countries. So it won't be exactly just so-called white Protestant Americans who'll be dropping off into these zones. There'll most likely be Arab navies involved as well, and maybe even paramilitary companies, the United Arab Emirates Navy, which has been, again, training, and they've been fighting against Somalian pirates, for example, for a few years now. So there's a few militaries and navies that will be most likely involved in the coming assaults. But I think the fears and the anxieties that the Iranian leadership may have, and this is why General Ghalibaf, and the spokesperson of the Iranian parliament, this is why he's sort of still kept the door open for any sort of negotiations and a move towards diplomacy, is because once the U.S. opens up the doors and isolates the southern areas of Iran to potential invasion, most likely the U.S. can undertake this operation at any point in the near future. Again, the U.S. is constantly burning the fuel. They are using taxpayer American dollars, which, again, I don't think the Trump administration minds sending the U.S. debt well over the $40 trillion mark, where exactly it's headed. And of course, we know the U.S. budget has just been announced, that the new military budget at $1.5 trillion. I think Trump is willing to expend whatever money is necessary in order to achieve his means and ends in this particular conflict. And it does appear to me that those particular areas in the south of Iran will be potential targets for perhaps several months to come. And maybe in the short term, yes, there will be some sort of abrupt initial operation that will bring around some sort of results, perhaps the opening up of the straits for a very short time before Iran begins to, again, retaliate, heavily bombing any sort of U.S. deployment zones with massive swarms of drones, which I no doubt, and I hope the Iranians do have those drones and ballistic missiles from within their own country. Because you correctly said, Conrad, it does seem like the bombing and the U.S. assaults against Iranian bases, and yes, there have been actual military bases hit as well. For example, in Sistan, near the Baluchistan province, there was a mechanized, armed, actually official Iranian military base hit, which again had Iranian tanks most likely destroyed. And the U.S. carried out this airstrike. It's really interesting because this is not an IRGC base. This is an official military army base. And we have heard U.S. commentators, more of the hawks, the George Soros type, stating that perhaps the Iranian army will need to revolt against the IRGC to carry out a regime change. But it doesn't look like the U.S. is necessarily discriminating between the IRGC and the regular army now. It seems like the approach is just to entirely take out any sort of military positions that Iran may have openly around the Straits of Hormuz in order to then procure most likely either a short-term or a long-term descent to capture these particular territories. Yeah, Bandar Abbas, again, is going to be very hard to capture a city and to hold a city of such size, 500 to 700,000 people at least. Most likely there will be Iranian refugees traveling north, leaving Bandar Abbas in anticipation of most likely the central government from Tehran losing control of these areas. There will be people, of course, leaving Bushehr as well, and most likely Karg Island. If there are any civilians there, they're also anticipating, no doubt, again, that potentially a U.S. invasion. There have been multiple ships hit throughout the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf And even close to the Oman coast, there was a U.S. Marine helicopter that dropped off, again, U.S. Marines onto I believe it was the Wenyao, a commercial vessel which apparently was carrying Iranian crude oil, and that was seized. So the U.S. is not just carrying out these sort of long-range bombardment operations, they're also hitting commercial vessels now. In fact, it's hard to say which side has hit more commercial vessels in the Straits of Hormuz and the surrounding territories. Was it the Americans or the Iranians? Both sides have now completely basically declared war on any vessels that are now disrespecting their own respective rules of travel in this particular area. So it's incredibly tumultuous and I think hazardous for any commercial vessel to be moving anywhere in that particular area. But again, so some of those brave sea captains are just traversing it anyhow, or attempting to at least. And I think the really controversial perspective here, Conrad, is that it does appear that even if Iran is completely isolated in those southern areas and sort of cut off from the rest of the country, and all the highways, the bridges are destroyed. And yes, there's at least 8 bridges hit over the last week, and that's a huge number if you consider, for example, the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. Not a single bridge has been significantly damaged or hit over the last 4 years. Perhaps there was only one bridge in the Kherson which was damaged during the Russian evacuation out of Kherson, or just before that.
And the Kerch Bridge, of course.
Well, the Kerch Bridge, exactly, yeah. But I suppose somewhat outside of the SMO zone, but certainly the attack on bridges is absolutely like the pristine tactic to be used here. And I think the Americans are doing, from their perspective, the correct move to isolate these areas. Now, I think the big issue here is the Iranians have already made sure that they have these underground bases basically located on the coast of the Straits of Hormuz, on these islands. They have these maritime naval headquarters. They have, for example, these most likely even amphibious vessels and ways to actually plant the mines in the Straits of Hormuz without actually needing to resupply these areas for a long time. They're actually prepared, I think, in the south of Iran to withstand a naval American siege, and they have been preparing for this, I think, for a long time, knowing the Straits of Hormuz were going to be that only leverage zone that will secure them their sort of sovereign right to, again, pursue their own regional geopolitical ends. And it is quite curious to me exactly what the US is going to be doing once they land, for example, on Keshem, on Bandar Abbas, in Bushehr, perhaps even, of course, not touching the Russian nuclear power plant, perhaps. And again, they've been very careful not trying to damage that nuclear power plant in any capacity, or even Chabahar. So if they take all these territories, it's going to turn into this long-term policing strategy, perhaps with the involvement of the Arabs. That looks like that's what the Americans are planning to do. Again, moving, especially during the summer of 2026, deeper into Iran from the coastal territories seems like completely suicidal. But if we really anticipate the U.S. Somehow striking a ceasefire or a peace deal with the Iranians by taking these southern territories, as soon as the U.S. boots are on the ground on Iranian territories, I think they can say goodbye to any sort of further negotiations. It'll be basically a wartime circumstance. And I think the Iranians will have a similar attitude towards any negotiations that the Ukrainians had once the Russians, for example, entered into these special military operations zones, where even somebody as foolish and as inexperienced as Zelensky basically put on his military uniform and hasn't really taken it off. There won't be any of these Abbas Arakchi or Ghalibaf proposals for diplomacy. It'll be war, and that war will be endless. There'll be constant streams of ballistic missiles flying into U.S. bases at the GCC states, and again, most likely the war and these policing operations along the coast to, basically make the Straits of Hormuz a safe passage zone. I think they'll eventually be incredibly costly. It'll make the Trump's administration, the Purim War overall, incredibly damaging. It'll make the Straits of Hormuz and this entire operation to open it up incredibly costly. It might even cost more. It might even be cheaper, in fact, to keep the straits closed rather than engage in whatever the US is preparing to do at the moment. But what we're seeing now, this past week, I think, and our listeners will agree, this is a softening up, a probing operation. And again, most likely, they are making the south of Iran a safe zone for further engagement, further operations. And this is very scary because in and of itself, this is not going to open up the Straits of Hormuz. It's a preparation for something else, perhaps something very dire, at least for the American sailors, Marines, and airborne commandos who, again, have been training for several weeks now to prepare for some sort of operation, take the Iranian coast.
No, and speaking of operations to take the Iranian coast, we have to keep the prophecies of Elder Joseph of Vatopedi in mind. Again, this elder died in 2009. These prophecies were likely given in the late 90s, early 2000s. He openly says an attack by America and Israel against Iran is imminent. Then the Russians will move south to help their allies, especially the Iranians. The Americans will have occupied Iran's coastal zone after a fierce struggle, but they will not be able to advance inland due to the strong resistance they will face. So again, this is all happening. It talks about then the Russians ultimately getting involved here. He goes on to ultimately say, again, talking about the Turks closing the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, is very much mirroring St. Paisios. But quickly after this, it says, what will cause the Russians to falter, leading them to pull back their forces, will be the betrayal of the Chinese, who, although initially aligned with them, will later back out in exchange for the greatest deal ever made, the occupation of Siberia. They will allow NATO forces to strike the Russians from behind. Of course, we talk all about that in our episode with Greg Reese, so be sure to check that out. But this shows you that if things go as they go with these potential American escalations, with moving on the coast of Iran, then we can likely anticipate the fall of Erdogan and the closure of the straits to Russian ships very, very quickly, because I would assume that that would also facilitate, if the Russians are going to get involved in helping the Iranians and their other allies down there, then I would assume that the Turkish elements of the prophecies would be on the brink of being fulfilled as well. But of course, you talked about the total failure of negotiations. Dmitri Galibov is still signaling that he wants to keep the door open. Of course, J.D. Vance, obviously the American, main progenitor of the MOU, is trying to take credit for it. But Galibov was saying, war and negotiation are two methods of protecting the national interest, he said, insisting that negotiations are part of safeguarding national interests, not synonymous with compromise. And again, at this point, if I was Galibov, Aragchi, or Pezeshkian, and I wasn't literally some kind of agent of disruption and anti-national interest in Iran, I would be quiet and I would allow the supreme leader to listen to his military advisors in the IRGC that are undoubtedly telling him the most effective ways to respond militarily, because at this point, you need to exert and expand the hurt factor here against the Americans, which, again, it seems that some kind of response in the realm of infrastructure is incoming, and the Saudis are trying to de-escalate with the Houthis because they recognize that their energy is under threat. We're going to discuss that in a second. But according to sources, a Situation Room meeting on Tuesday included discussions about, this is in the U.S., broadening the air campaign against Iranian military and energy infrastructure, deploying U.S. ground forces to seize Karg Island, Iran's main export hub, and striking the deeply fortified nuclear-linked Pickaxe Mountain complex, which has not yet been targeted. Apparently, Trump has not yet made a final decision and continues to say he would prefer a diplomatic solution. Obviously, the diplomatic solution part of that seems to have gone out the window, with now the dozens of refueling planes and the F-16s all being dragged towards Israel and Ben Gurion Airport. Do not count on it being quiet if you attack us. Do not count on a rerun. This will be a different event, much more powerful, Netanyahu warned on Tuesday. So the Israelis, as of now, have not yet gotten involved in this. Iran has not yet struck Israel. So we are sort of waiting for that to occur. That's a lot of reasons why apparently there have not been as many strikes on Tehran or across northern or western Iran, is because Israel hasn't been involved, and the U.S. largely relies on them to handle a lot of those areas due to their air superiority in the region. Of course, again, the 60-day clock has supposedly been reset for Trump's war in Iran. So as far as their operations, they assume would want to keep it under 60 days. So if there is going to be a ground operation, in theory, it would need to happen probably in the next 2 weeks, I would assume, for it to not want to be have to then drag them into, it likely will drag them past the 60-day mark regardless of what happens, because we know that they will face fierce resistance and not be able to advance inland, as Joseph of Vatopedi says, and it will likely be, again, a sort of cauldron, as it were, as the language we're familiar with in the Russia-Ukraine war, where the troops will have some kind of beachhead and go in, but they will just be fired upon potentially by hypersonic missiles if the Russians are supposedly to get involved, which would be something that America currently, at least publicly, has no way of defending against. And so we're hearing a lot about Pickaxe Mountain. Trump openly said, Pickaxe is a possible target for a nice big fat shot right into the front door. We're going to take out Pickaxe Mountain, let the Iranians know we are coming. There's not a damn thing they can do about it. That's what he said in the past 24 hours. Of course, Pickaxe Mountain is believed to be where Iran transferred part of its highly enriched uranium stockpile before the strikes on Fordo, Isfahan, and the other places in Natanz in Operation Midnight Hammer back in 2025. The facility's depth and scale are believed to exceed those of Fordo, actually, making it significantly more difficult to destroy with conventional bunker buster munitions. if fully operational, Mount Pickaxe could potentially match or even surpass Fordo's uranium enrichment capacity. So again, the fact that so much has already been dug out of the strikes that were conducted in Midnight Hammer, how much can America really do on Pickaxe Mountain without, dropping a nuclear weapon, which again is technically always an option. Of course, not just Ghalibaf, but Abbas Araghchi was tweeting, his last tweet was, Americans are being warned of foreign influence. How about the extensive Israeli campaign to bamboozle the U.S. administration into an unwinnable war of choice? Even worse, Israel is using U.S. taxpayer dollars to silence any U.S. critics. It will all soon unravel. So, that's a little bit better of a statement than Ghalibaf, projecting propaganda against the American regime about how they're controlled by Israel. I think is a lot more useful at this point than talking about negotiations. Of course, Dmitri, you talked about the Chabahar port, which again is an important port to Iran because they can use their ships to get out of that port and immediately enter into Pakistani waters where the U.S. Blockade has no effect, and they can just hug the coast of Pakistan and basically just blockade, or rather surpass the U.S. blockade, make it down through the Straits of Malacca and get to the Eastern Asian energy markets where they are mostly, most of the crude oil is being used in China and a few other places. This is from RN. It says here, Chabahar is Iran's only oceanic commercial port outside of this that does not require entering the Strait of Hormuz. And during the U.S. attack on Chabahar, the U.S. has for the third time targeted the port control tower, and this time the tower completely collapsed. It's a very fascinating image of just the tower exploding and falling over to the side. So again, with those strikes, the strikes on the bridges, the strikes on the desalination and electrical facilities. Again, it was actually last week, I believe, that Dmitri and I discussed, I believe it was Sirik Island or Kish Island, where civilian energy infrastructure was struck, and technically Iran didn't immediately respond to that. So I guess America thought they could get away with more. They went for more, and now we've seen the moderate response on Kuwait. If there's not a greater response, I would obviously call a lot of the Iranian statements into question. But we have Mohsen Rezaian, the main IRGC advisor to Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei. He says Iran is about to go on the offensive if U.S. bombings continue, doing complete offensives and destruction. We are no longer satisfied with reciprocity. We also saw the commander of the IRGC Navy that said the Americans are bringing themselves closer with every passing moment to the 0 hour for operations against CENTCOM's naval units in the region's waters. Just wait. The movements and equipment of the terrorist American military are under the surveillance of Iran's naval units. And you have to ask, what color flag are they raising this time? I mean, I thought we've already raised the red flag, the black flag. I mean, what other color flags of revenge do we need to just do the thing? You know what I mean? How many more? I mean, they bombed another hospital that caused children who were undergoing cancer treatment to be evacuated. I don't know if any of them died, thankfully. But again, the idea of somehow there's more warnings to be issued while the MOU has already collapsed. Again, it shows you how there's clearly some disagreement in some of these elements. And at this point, Mojtaba Khamenei and the IRGC need to make it very clear that they're in the driver's seat and the status of negotiations has been put on the back burner. And that probably would include putting Pezeshkian, Ghalibaf, and Araghchi on the back burner, publicly speaking. That's at least my perspective. And I think Syrian girl, our good friend Maram, she had a good perspective on this. She said here, the U.S. is setting the tempo on the Iran war, and Iran is just letting them do it. During Operation True Promise 3, the Washington Post publicly stated that Israel would run out of interceptors in 10 to 12 days. Iran then agrees to a ceasefire 12 days later. That's obviously what we know as the 12-day war. That's when the U.S. realized that they can turn the Iran war on and off like a switch whenever they need to reload. This happened again when Trump gave the war with Iran 4 to 6 week timeline after assassinating Khamenei, and his generals said there would be multiple off-ramps and opportunities for de-escalation. Iran agreed to a ceasefire whenever the U.S. called for timeout. The Iranians are very intelligent people, so what's really behind the decision to fight this war on the enemy's timeline? Never again must a ceasefire be agreed to by Iran on the U.S.'s timeline, and this is very much the mindset of a large amount of the Iranian people that take to the streets and are protesting in favor of the IRGC and the supreme leader against Pezeshkian, Ghalibaf, Araghchi. I can't remember who it was. I think it was Araghchi or maybe Pezeshkian. There's videos of him getting heckled in the streets, calling him a dove and calling him somebody that shouldn't be in the driver's seat because he is far too soft on the United States. So that is the internal Iranian decision-making situation. The strikes, the sites that they have struck so far, they've hit the Al-Azraq Air Base in Jordan, Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, the Ali Al-Salem Air Base in Kuwait, the Naval Support Activity NSA site in Bahrain, the Sheikh Isa Air Base in Bahrain, the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the Masirah Air Base in Oman, which had U.S. Shipping logistics and naval logistics, Erbil International Airport and the Coalition Air Base in Iraqi Kurdistan, the U.S. consulate compound in Iraqi Kurdistan, Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, Al-Tanf base supposedly in Syria that Americans evacuated in February of 2026, the King Faisal Air Base in Jordan, the Sheikh Zayed military city, which is the UAE base in Abu Dhabi, and the Houthis struck King Khalid Air Base in Saudi Arabia. We'll get to that in a second. But that seems to be the major sites that Iran has struck in retaliation to the strikes on their southern coast. And as of right now, we are awaiting the further escalation of Iran's response to the strikes on their energy facilities, infrastructure, civilian energy infrastructure, and of course the bridges, which seems to have been begun with these strikes on Kuwait, which included, again, strikes on desal facilities and other energy infrastructure. The Iranian parliament also met this past week for the first time and introduced bills regarding the regulations of the Strait of Hormuz. This here is from AA, Turkish news outlet. An Iranian lawmaker said Tuesday a new bill was submitted to parliament on the regulation of transit through the Strait of Hormuz amid military escalation with the U.S. over the waterway. The bill was submitted last night, coinciding with the downing of U.S. drones. Ibrahim Azizi, head of the Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, wrote on the U.S. social media company X, "We remain steadfast in defending our red lines, particularly regarding the management of the Strait of Hormuz," he said. "This is the first step. Subsequent measures are forthcoming," Aziz warned. His remarks came amid an exchange of attacks between Iran and the U.S. over the Strait of Hormuz in recent days. Washington and Tehran signed an MOU last month that included a ceasefire to pave the way for reaching lasting peace agreements. Last week, however, President Donald Trump declared the memorandum over. And in the past week, travel through the Strait of Hormuz has slowed to a near halt. On July 16th, 8 ships crossed through the Strait of Hormuz, and as of today, as this is being recorded, July 17th, there have been effectively no reported crossings. Satellite imagery is showing effectively no movement through the strait whatsoever. Of course, the situation, it seems, again, the Iranian parliament is going to be expressing more hardline views. I believe it was 180 members of the Majlis, which is the name of the Iranian parliament, basically expressed in a memorandum of their own, which basically proves that they would be able to pass this as a kind of law or some kind of official declaration in the parliament that they want to pull out of all negotiations with the U.S. immediately and basically require some kind of process to re-enter into those negotiations. So the parliament, the supreme leader, the IRGC are all aligned against negotiations. To me, it seems that unless something very foolish happens, a foolish decision is made, or certain characters are more compromised than we may think, I think we will see the escalation ladder very much increase. So before we talk about Iraq, Kuwait, a few of these other countries, and Yemen, of course, the situation with the Houthis, do you have any final thoughts on the situation in the Strait of Hormuz, in Iran, on the Strait, on this potential U.S. operation? Of course, not as many people have been covering it. I think we were the first people really to talk about it extensively 2-3 weeks ago, that the U.S. currently has more amphibious landing vessels and marine battalions on these ships to actually facilitated an operation taking Karg Island, Keshem Island, Charbahar Port, Bandar Abbas, a lot of these coastal regions that are being struck than ever before. And again, it seems to me that in Trump's, kind of retard mind, they're like, all right, we're just going to carpet bomb all of the southern coast, destroy everything. Then we'll land our guys on the islands and the coast, and we'll be able to negotiate. Maybe he doesn't think they'll do much more than that, but we'll be able to negotiate with Iran the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. And if they don't agree, we'll just reopen it ourselves and our guys will stay there and prevent the bombs from flying. So that seems to be sort of the Trump calculus. What are your final thoughts on these possibilities, Dmitri, and the situation domestically in Iran before we move on to some of these surrounding countries?
Yeah, I think it's entirely realistic, especially if you consider some of Trump's advisors, especially those of the Talmudic persuasion, having these sort of historical references, like these massive shipping lanes have, over the last 600 years been controlled by various parties. I mean, even if you look at the Mediterranean, right, even before the creation of the Suez, you did have the Bosphorus, Dardanelles constantly controlled by major empires. At some points, the Venetians, Genoese tried to take control of these particular connection points. You had the Genoese attempting to negotiate control, or even by force taking control at the linkage point between the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. You had the British essentially taking the Gibraltar and still holding it to this day. Can you imagine the Pillars of Hercules essentially still under the control of the United Kingdom, even after the fall of the British Empire? Like, this is So the idea of foreign imperial control over waterways is a well-established tradition all over the world, specifically in Europe and the Middle East. This is nothing old, and something that definitely Trump, he sees himself, at least I think in his mind, despite being this like long-term capitalist, not somebody of any aristocratic lineage, he does see himself as this new Genoese doge, right, who can sort of control, no pun intended there, but control these particular key points of interconnection and actually just manage them better than maybe even the native population can, right? And for these excuses of basically commercial well-being and the world economy running smoothly and the Americans somehow monetarily benefiting from all of this, I think those illusions need to go right out the window, because already more money has been spent perhaps on this entire Purim War debacle than perhaps has been actually injected into, for example, the American medical system or other internal domestic escapades on a federal level that would have actually helped the American people at home. But yes, no, the money spending outside, especially in the Straits of Hormuz, I think it's going to continue to be expanded. I think Trump has already sort of kicked the bucket down the road, and he's actually anticipating on perhaps controlling a city such as Bandar Abbas. Like in the past, Bandar Abbas, after the fall of Constantinople, when you had basically the conflicts between the Shia-based Persian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, these two sort of fighting sides, you did have a temporary control of Bandar Abbas for if 100 years or so, or at least several decades, by the Portuguese. Later, Bandar Abbas was taken by the Anglo-Dutch, essentially, coalition. These particular areas linking the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Arabia, they have been taken by foreign forces in the past. And just to give you some reference point, Conrad, sadly, do Iranian Zoomers, Iranian millennials, Iranian TikTokers, the Persians within the major cities of Isfahan, Qom, Tehran, further up north, which do they actually understand the severity of what is happening? Like this national sovereignty is being breached. They may believe that, well, whatever's happening down south, that's just the military, that's the radicals doing their thing, that's the IRGC messing around with America, with the GCC states, with Israel. It has nothing to do with our livelihood in the capital city. Maybe this is also why the bombing has been somewhat isolated to the southern points, because keep in mind the distance between Bandar Abbas and Tehran is actually longer. It's about 1,200 kilometers. It's actually further than the distance between Donetsk, as the crow flies, and Moscow. So in fact, Donetsk and Moscow are actually closer, and we have seen over the last 4 years the attitude between the actual Muscovites, people living in Russia's major capital cities and million-person cities outside of Donetsk. It hasn't exactly been completely unilaterally in favor of the people, unfortunately, of the people living in those special military operations zones. It took a lot of very passionate, energetic people to bring awareness to the fact that like there were Russian citizens suffering in areas of Bryansk, Kursk, Lugansk, and Donetsk, and not every Muscovite wants to head down and help with humanitarian aid, etc. And I think maybe, if you compare the people of Iran and the people of the Russian Federation, both countries essentially experiencing this prolonged siege. Well, in Iran's case, we're sort of at the beginning of it. How much does the average middle class or lower middle class person actually care about Bandar Abbas and some of these areas being temporarily occupied by some international coalition? And that's the question. Is it only the 300,000 or so IRGC, the sort of Iranian version of the SS? Are they the only ones who really care about temporary occupation? Or similar, I would say, to, unfortunately, this is a sad example, but in Lebanon, for example, like people are still going clubbing to nightclubs, etc., in the city of Beirut, not essentially trying to ignore what's happening south of the Litani River. There are still people essentially enjoying big city life and ignoring the fact that their national sovereignty is being breached. So I think Trump is somewhat a little bit smart and tactile in the way he's approaching it, almost already dissecting the territory of Iran on the American map, saying like, we will be the caretakers and the police officers of this particular region, of these major cities, Bushehr, Bandar Abbas, Chabahar, and the rest of the country. You can live as you have lived prior to this. And of course, Iranian trade will then be, again, curtailed and controlled by this GCC American coalition. The reason I say this is it's just very clear the attitudes that, again, the Russian population has had towards the suffering of the locals in Gorlovka, in Mariupol, and these other places. It hasn't exactly been unilateral and entirely in favor. And this is why the Russian state perhaps has somewhat even not even forced a second mobilization, because again, it wouldn't even be popular in the major cities to go out and save, unfortunately, their brotherly Slavic population in those striving zones. And I do wonder exactly how united the Iranian population really is in these major cities. Are they willing to engage in a civilizational, major destructive war over some of these coastal territories, which frankly are not as populated as the central Iranian and northern Iranian districts, so sort of all of those major cities. And I think the Trump administration has taken this into account, most likely with their Israeli advisors. And it does appear that at this point, our conclusions from a month ago, Conrad, that they do continue. Yes, it doesn't seem like Iran has the same surface-to-air missile defense system set up in the south of the country as much as it does have around Tehran. The capital cities are well and truly more prudently defended, and the Americans have done, in a way, from their perspective, a good job of actually disabling any sort of threats that may target their helicopters, their warplanes, the B-1, B-52, and B-2 bombers that may potentially be flying over some of those southern zones in the coming weeks. And I do sort of anticipate that the Iranian, as we've spoken about for a while now, the Iranian approach to essentially American aggression at this point, as of this week, has been essentially to bomb all these various bases in the GCC and in the broader Middle East, be it in Syria, Iraq, and especially Jordan. And I think it is quite curious. Again, the best defense at the moment from Iran's perspective is like a potent offense. You need to make the war so costly that Trump will slow down, that Trump will again come to the negotiating table. And unfortunately, we haven't exactly seen that strategy work in other wars, for example, the Russo-Ukrainian war, because you can't necessarily force the other side to outspend. And yes, I understand there is, for example, a shortage of the national fuel reserves in America, for example. There are these long-term issues coming to a forefront, but the long-term strategy of having your enemy economically gasping for air and economically surrendering is, I think, a very risky strategy for the Iranians to take at this point. So I'm not quite sure what their best approach is, but this is potentially, Conrad, why the Ghalibaf and some of the people inside of Iran are trying to at least still come to the negotiating table before any sort of operation by the U.S. is undertaken. And this is maybe why even the bridge linking Bahrain and linking the Saudi Arabia, the 25-kilometer bridge, hasn't actually been hit officially yet, although that has been obviously a potent target. Yeah, clearly the American bases in Bahrain are not moving. The Americans are not leaving the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait. They're clearly stationed there. The Iranians are trying to harass them, trying to force the Americans out, but these Arab countries are not interested in actually giving any leeway to Iran. It does seem like, if anything, the Iranians ballistically bombing, and yes, we can say some of those strikes have been accurate. Again, the losses are not necessarily being reported. We don't have a clear report of American losses or the losses of these Arab states, although Iran itself hasn't suffered too much from the bombing. And over the last week, they've said they've lost 38 people and 400 injured. Most likely those losses are going to only increase in number as this weekend sort of carries over into the 9th of Ab, Talmudic feast day, when no doubt the slaughter will increase. But just keep in mind the other potential scenario, Conrad, is obviously the Americans can sit their navy just on the entrance to the Straits of Hormuz in the Sea of Arabia, continue these bombing campaigns over a pretty decent long period of time, whittling down the Iranians, and there will be a constant state of anxiety within Iranian society that at any point there could be a land amphibious operation, especially during this period before the midterms. At any week, on any given day, especially during a weekend or like a Friday as the markets close, there could be an American descent operation. And yet you don't know when that's going to happen, just like with Maduro with the Caribbean Sea operation, where they were just outside of Caracas sitting there for weeks and months on end, and you didn't know until Delta Force, of course, struck at one point at night. And again, it was obviously well coordinated with traders within the Venezuelan society and within Caracas itself and Delcy Rodriguez, etc. But no one actually saw that coming. And so, in fact, the Americans are, at the moment, they have the basketball in their court. They can actually choose the strategy of attack. And in some ways, unfortunately, the Iranians are on the responding end. And you're right, Conrad, perhaps it will take some initiative from the Iranians, maybe not just bombing the air bases located in Jordan, but perhaps going further than that. And actually, just like Saddam Hussein during the 1990-1991 Gulf War, how did that war end so quickly? And how did the Americans come to the negotiating table? Well, he threatened to bomb Israel to smithereens, right? He threatened actually the pearl in the eyes of the Americans, the gem of the Middle East, their main, of course, headquarters of interest, to be again attacked. And the Iranians haven't gone that far yet. In fact, most of their bombings of these major bases, major American joint Arab bases around the GCC states, they've almost been probing in action. They haven't actually dealt perhaps as much damage as we those in favor of Iran would want to have seen. And it does seem like at the moment the Iranians are still trying to not let the war escalate into an unfortunate point of no return. And this may be, I think, in fact, a mistake, because the Americans will keep their navies. And again, who knows, maybe they'll call the Charles de Gaulle to return. Maybe they'll call the Prince of Wales from the UK to join them as well. And perhaps, I think, at this point, it's the response. And if this information is accurate, if the reports about the Bab-el-Mandeb were in fact true, that, look, the Iranians have said, if you'll be hitting any sort of power stations, any key civilian infrastructure, I mean, technically the Americans have already struck civilian infrastructure, but beyond, for example, the grain silo located in the Khuzestan province, which is the heavy gas oil province located in the southwest of Iran, if the Americans go anywhere beyond that, then they will call upon the Yemenis Houthis to shut down the Bab-el-Mandeb, which is 10% of the global maritime trade, and this will in fact cause this immense snowballing of economic crisis to hit critical mass. I do think the Iranians are in fact well and truly sort of in a way running out of options beyond just going into a full total war type scenario. And I do wonder exactly within Tehran itself, the decision makers, those surrounding the supreme leader, exactly how much, who of them are willing to actually go that full, to take it to that full destination and declaring war essentially on the entire Ummah, on the entire Sunni Muslim world, allied with Israel and the Americans. Because, look, unfortunately, we have seen, the official statements out of the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, and they have said that their position is that both sides should sit down at the negotiating table. So they're completely it's out of the realm of realism. It's like if China's calling for the straits to be open, but it's clear Trump's not that interested in that. He only wants the straits opened if they are under total American control. The MOU is completely out the window. Iran's allies, how realistic do they see the situation? Are they going to be standing by Iran, or is it going to be a March, April type situation just after the commencing of the Purim War, where you saw these American stealth raids over the territory of Iran, flying over pretty much with impunity at nighttime and bombing major cities, including the major kilometer-long bridge outside of the capital city itself. So unfortunately, I do see Iran in almost like a reactionary position, and Iran really hasn't, I think, really shown the Americans at this point. They haven't attempted to, for example, strike at any of the major destroyers. They haven't dealt any, well, at least it's unreported, they haven't dealt any major damage to any aircraft carriers or their supporting fleets. Is Iran going to somehow threaten the Americans to the point to make the war in a way too costly? And at this point, the threats are just simply not there. For Trump, it appears that the doorway is open. Yeah, I think in his twisted mind and the mind of those behind him in the Trump administration, they do see it as essentially a possibility. And even J.D. Vance hinted at the fact that 150,000 American troops, he says he doesn't want to see them landing boots on the ground in Iran. People, unfortunately, are a little bit delusional, thinking 150,000 Americans are going to be driving 1,000 kilometers through from Bandar Abbas all the way to Tehran or all the way to Isfahan, for example. But this taking the coastal territories is a lot more realistic. And once America takes control of those territories, they can again move the escalation ladder further and say, look, if Iran attacks these American-held defensive positions, we will begin bombing your capital cities, just like we bombed Baghdad in 1991, just like we bombed Baghdad in 2003, and all of your official decision-making centers. It won't be like a President Putin attacking Kiev situation where all of the, again, unfortunately, the Kievan parliament, the decision-making centers are, again, still standing after 4 years. The Americans and the Israelis will not take a similar position. That pyramid, that Masonic parliament located in Tehran will not be standing, I think, once the Americans, again, make those threats and, again, stick by them. So, again, the decision-making centers within Tehran haven't been hit yet, and that, again, is something that I think the Iranians anticipate. If they push the escalation ladder further, the losses will be much more drastic, and it could be something that perhaps, I'm not saying the regime cannot recover from that, but the Iran itself will be heavily diminished. And what can they exactly do? And again, the big query, Conrad, this is the biggest question mark. Why hasn't Iran exactly struck Israel yet? Or why hasn't it even threatened Israel openly? This is, again, it appears to be a almost bilateral conflict with America and its GCC allies. Israel seems to be completely out of the conversation despite their ongoing genocide in Lebanon.
I wouldn't necessarily say that the U.S. hasn't struck decision-making headquarters in Iran. I mean, every IRGC headquarters has been destroyed. They killed the supreme leader. They killed all the heads of the IRGC at the beginning of the war. So they did already do all of that. But yeah, they could destroy the parliament. I guess they could kill the president and these people. But I mean, why would they want to kill Galibaf, Pezeshkian? These are like the people that are almost on their side at this point. But you talk about the seizing of the coastal zone. I think you're very much correct. They're going to try to, if they achieve that, they're going to try to use that as some kind of negotiating chip in and of itself. And the question you have to ask is, according to these prophecies, of course, Russia will be assisting Iran in this capability. You have to assume China, if, before they betray the Russians, I guess, according to the prophecies, they would likely also get involved on the Iranian side. Because at this point, they would say, what's more likely, that the Americans who just invaded Iran and are going to, just like they did with Venezuela, are going to cut us off from our number one current crude oil supplier? If they take control of the strait, are we just going to assume they're going to let us get the oil and not just charge fees on us or blockade us again? It's probably better for us to just fight against this and hope that we can return to a status quo where the Iranians control the strait. So you'd think that finally something like that would get the Chinese to get involved, but who knows? The Chinese tiger is really more like the Chinese dragon is really more like the Chinese panda when it comes to how quickly it responds to these sorts of things. But again, oil is already rocketed over $83 a barrel at this point, so we can anticipate with the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait closure, which I'm going to discuss here in a second, like you just mentioned, Dmitri, that's going to really capitalize and sort of expedite very rapidly at a exponential level the economic problems that the world is going to be facing in regards to this, and the potential unrest situation here in America might escalate. But the Iranians, they know what is being threatened. Of course, one of the few strikes outside of southern Iran that happened in the past few days during the resumption of strikes, some of the earlier few strikes that occurred in the early July, in the 8th and the 9th. So the railway that was attacked then, Iran has repaired the portion of the Aktake Khan Railway in Akhala County, Golistan province, that was damaged by either U.S. standoff munitions or local partisans. So they don't even know who potentially damaged it, but they very quickly have restored rail traffic to one of the main connection points with the Iran-China rail line through Turkmenistan, through Afghanistan. That is a critical lifeline as the American blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf against Iran continues. They need these overland routes to get energy to China, to insulate China from the impending energy crisis, and to, of course, keep money flowing into the Iranian economy. The Iranian rial is at $1.3 million rials to the dollar.
Wow.
The economy is getting very bad. They are sort of locked in on wartime ideological mode. I mean, if the people start to lose faith in the regime and the supreme leader, eventually the economic situation is going to lead to some unrest, not necessarily them supporting America, but again, more domestic issues that would make it much more difficult to wage the war. So the Iranians are going to have to deal with that. And I think the best way right now to satisfy those people is to, listen to the people in the streets, which is actually attack American ships, actually attack Israel, actually attack the infrastructure around these places. And again, don't keep calling everything an operation and retaliation. It's time to get serious and go to war here. And of course, in some capacities, they have been serious, and it's not always public. For example, the Iranian army, the Artesh, revealed in a statement that the 65th Nohed Airborne Special Forces Brigade has carried out 11 missions inside Iraqi Kurdistan during the recent war, eliminating 8 mid to high level commanders and destroying 3 Kurdish bases. And again, the strikes on Iraqi Kurdistan have been pretty much nonstop for the past few days. Major Kurdish opposition groups and terrorist group ammo depots have been destroyed. One of this entire hill in Iraqi Kurdistan in Suleimaniye was completely lit up. Every depot, every troop barrack was completely destroyed, as well as, of course, the American bases in Erbil was struck. So the Iranians are hammering Iraqi Kurdistan, preventing any potential ground operation coming in from the Kurds. They know that is, again, besides the operations from the U.S. and the southern zone and the islands like we've been discussing, and of course American and Israeli strikes, the incursion from the Kurds is the most likely. So the question you have to ask is, what if Azerbaijan is like a backup plan here? I mean, there's not a lot of talk about that, and the Turks are, of course, completely staying out of it. So it seems that the Azerbaijanis don't want any of this smoke, but the reality of the situation is that the Kurdish people are getting absolutely pummeled, and their proxy of them as a proxy of the U.S. and Israel, I think, have never been more degraded than they are right now, which is part of why we're hearing, we want Syria to go into Lebanon. We need them to integrate the SDF and all these other sorts of things. But of course, in Iraq, not only have the Iraqi Army ground forces been operating there this whole time, but the UAE's Dana Gas Company has suspended operations at all main production facilities in the Khor Mor gas field of Iraq due to credible security threats. That's one of the bigger Iraqi oil fields operated by a UAE-based company that has now completely closed everything down. The Iraqi government also immediately following, of course, a meeting with Donald Trump, President al-Zaidi, Prime Minister of Iraq al-Zaidi, and his government have placed sanctions on ISIS and Lebanese Hezbollah, two very different entities that have fought each other in wars. I guess both are now guilty of violating whatever Iraq views as them violating to warrant sanctions. So that is an escalation there. Some more U.S. pressure being placed on Iraq, as for a while Iraq really was becoming a sort of Iranian ally here, between how much Kurdistan has been dismantled, the almost full U.S. pullout of the other bases around Iraq, and the domination of the Shia militias there. It seems that Iraq really was getting fully integrated with Iran, but it seems America's not giving up 100% yet. But going to Yemen, probably the most effective Iranian ally they currently have right now. It says here, a leading official from Yemen's Ansarallah, this is from Dropsite News, vowed that the group would block Saudis' access to the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait, a vital bottleneck connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean, in response to strikes on Sana'a airport on Monday that were blamed on Saudi Arabia. The move would exacerbate the economic impact of the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz, particularly on Asian markets currently relying on Saudi crude exports through the Red Sea. Ansarallah claimed on Monday night to have launched retaliatory strikes with ballistic missiles and drones hitting Aba airport in Saudi Arabia, with the Ansarallah official Mohammed al-Bukaiti telling Dropsite News that the strikes were merely one of the initial steps on a broader escalation. We will focus on intensifying our military operations, adding that the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait is a legitimate leverage tool. Ansarallah leader Abdul Malak al-Houthi added to the threats in a speech on Thursday, saying that all Saudi oil facilities and vital installations were targets. A statement on Wednesday by the IRGC also supported Ansarallah's pledge, warning that the other oil and gas export routes, in addition to the Strait of Hormuz, could be closed to the U.S. and its allies. They're talking about the overland pipelines from the Persian Gulf across Saudi Arabia to their ports and export facilities on the Red Sea, of course. It remained unclear whether Ansarallah would in fact carry out the threat to close off the vital waterway to Saudi Arabia, yet the latest developments have ushered in a dangerous game of brinksmanship. The strikes in Sana'a airport were the first attack by Saudi Arabia against Ansarallah, also known as the Houthis, since 2022. The attack and retaliatory missile and drone launches by the Houthis into Saudi Arabia, along with the vows of further escalation, threatened to upend a 4-year-long, tenuous ceasefire, just as the truce between the U.S. and Iran is crumbling over access through the Strait of Hormuz. The Saudi-backed internationally recognized Yemeni government, largely based in Riyadh, claimed responsibility for the strikes on Sana'a airport on Monday, saying they aimed to prevent the landing of an inbound Iranian flight carrying an Ansarallah delegation returning from Tehran for the funeral of Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. At least 4 individual strikes hit the runway shortly after a UN humanitarian air service flight departed from Sana'a. The Iranian Mahan air passenger plane diverted and later landed safely at Ansarallah-controlled Hodeidah airport in Yemen's Red Sea coast. In response, Ansarallah's military spokesman Yahya Saree accused Saudi Arabia of being behind the strikes and declared that the attacks ended the de-escalation phase, threatening consequences. The reported strike claimed by Ansarallah on Aba airport in Saudi Arabia, around 100 kilometers from Yemen's northern border, soon followed. Flights to and from Aba were canceled late Monday and Tuesday morning. So, of course, strikes were exchanged, and there have been more escalations on the ground between the Houthis and these other rebels. However, the Saudis seem to really not want the smoke. And so this is from Rerum Novarum. It says, in a significant development over the past 3 hours, Royal Jordanian Airways is expected to begin direct flights to Sana'a, the Ansarallah-controlled capital of Yemen, as early as next week. The move is viewed as part of Riyadh's effort to de-escalate tensions with the Ansarallah government by granting Sana'a International Airport somewhat operational autonomy. Houthi official media outlets, however, confirmed the planned flights, but demanded that Sana'a's airport should be open to all international destinations. So they, I guess they appreciate it, but they obviously want more, and it seems that they are still coordinating with the Iranians on the escalation ladder here. This is in the Telegraph. A source told the Telegraph of a deliberate Iranian attempt to control the other side of the Red Sea and create a scenario similar to its grip on the Strait of Hormuz. The Bab-el-Mandeb is on the west side of the Arabian Peninsula for Hormuz and forms a choke point between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. The Houthi rebel group, Tehran's most capable regional proxy, is laying the groundwork to close the strait, quietly extending its reach to the Horn of Africa, according to sources in Yemen. The Houthis in Yemen on the northeastern coast of the strait will work with al-Shabaab, the Somali militant group, to control both sides of the waterway. The aim is to inflict more pain on the global economy and increase pressure on Donald Trump. The source said there are a lot of indicators showing coordination between the Houthis and al-Shabaab. This coordination is aimed at totally controlling and blocking the Strait of Bab-el-Mandeb when Iran decides in the future. The Houthis are transferring drone technology to al-Shabaab on behalf of Iran, so the Houthis are becoming the leaders of the region. For now, the Houthis are holding back. The source said it's not a smart idea for Iran to use all its cards at the same time at the beginning. The Houthis have been taking lessons from Iran on how to withstand the kind of decapitation strikes that killed much of Tehran's leadership in the war, and are naming multiple successors for every senior post and readying for a prolonged fight. Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the group's leader, has designated a family member to replace him if he is killed, part of a system of shadow leaders. So I don't know about all the al-Shabaab stuff. I know al-Shabaab and Somali groups are honestly usually more supported by Turkey. So again, maybe this is another reason why Turkey is going to get involved. We're going to talk about Libya and some of that here in a second. But more and more forces from the Presidential Leadership Council, which is the Saudi-backed, internationally recognized government in Yemen, have been gathering, as have those in the Southern Transitional Council. Of course, Ansarallah commands a military force of 200,000 personnel, as well as 20,000 al-Houthi tribal forces, from the more rural areas, and 20,000 military reserves, whereas the PLC, which is the Saudi-backed forces, control 40,000 personnel, 10,000 more in their other coalition. They have 50,000 tribal forces, and they have 40,000 emergency forces, as well as about 40,000 members of other brigades. Then you have 75,000 personnel in the UAE-backed Southern Transitional Council separatist group. And Al Jazeera here says, in the event of a direct Ansarallah PLC confrontation, the Southern Transition Council would likely align with the PLC. This figure includes personnel from all STC's previous military formations, including the Hadrami elite forces, security belt forces, and storm brigades. I think some of those forces ultimately joined up with either Ansarallah or the Saudi-backed forces, but ultimately it doesn't really matter too much. But alas, regardless, Yemen is clearly going to be one of the next fronts. And if Iran starts striking Saudi Arabia, Yemen will probably follow suit. And if these escalations, as I believe will come from the United States, likely in response to the Iranian response to these bridge strikes, or exclusively on their own, whether it's Pickaxe Mountain or some of these other sites, or Karg Island, these ground operations, I think the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait will likely be closed before the end of July. That is my prediction right now. And of course, Kuwait has been one of the main places attacked. In the midst of all of this, troops there, I think, have come under fire. The casualties that we know about, obviously, there were troops that came under fire and were injured in Jordan. I believe Bahrain, there are casualties that have likely been covered up, as I know there was an Iranian strike on some kind of hotel or barracks where American troops were directly staying that they got intelligence on. So we'll have to stay posted on that. But a big surprise that has sort of emerged out of all this is Pakistan, as the MOU has collapsed, appears to have basically switched sides and is now invoking a lot of their defense obligations they have, again, with Saudi Arabia and these other states. This is from Reuters. It says, in Pakistan, there are growing concerns that Houthi involvement may be more likely to draw Pakistan into the conflict than the Iranian missile strikes were earlier this year. Pakistani soldiers are deployed near the Saudi border with Yemen, two Pakistani officials said, increasing their direct exposure. There are also concerns in Islamabad that a Houthi-led escalation could disrupt shipping in the Red Sea, an important trade route that Pakistan and many other countries depend on. A widening conflict there could be more difficult to contain and could target Saudi interests in a way that forces Pakistan to intervene militarily under the terms of its mutual defense pact. And this is also from Reuters. After the Iran-aligned Houthi movement launched an attack on Saudi Arabia on Monday, nuclear-armed Pakistan told Iran it would treat attacks on the kingdom as attacks on itself. And again, Reuters continues, Pakistan has also been negotiating an expanded defense pact with Kuwait in exchange for energy cooperation and investment, according to 5 sources with knowledge of the talks. Kuwait has had more limited defense deal with Pakistan for training and joint exercises since 2023. It is now seeking a show of force by Islamabad that would be similar to Pakistan's pact with Saudi Arabia, including thousands of Pakistani troops on the ground, fighter jets, drones on air defense systems, and other defense-related facilities, said a Pakistani government official. And like I said, that's according to Reuters. And again, in the midst of all of this, Kuwait announced that its power plants and desalination plants were attacked by Iran, sustaining damage. Again, Kuwait and Bahrain, I think, are the 2 states that have sustained by far the most damage relative to their size. The UAE is likely close, but they haven't experienced quite as many strikes in these past few days, and they are much smaller countries. I mean, Bahrain, absolutely tiny. Kuwait, almost as tiny. And again, the Iranians, these bridges have been struck. One of the more concerning issues as far as their escalation and their response here. And again, I'm hearing the language. It seems that there's going to be a strong response. They've closed the Strait of Hormuz. The Houthis are talking about closing the Bab-el-Mandeb Straits. But again, you mentioned strikes on Israel. I recognize that they maybe are hoping to keep Israel out of the air war for as long as possible, but they really need to cut that bridge off from Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. I recognize Saudi Arabia has faced the least amount of strikes. Saudi Arabia is trying to de-escalate with the Houthis. Saudi Arabia, I'm sure, is probably working with Qatar to de-escalate with Iran, but the Iranians really need to cut that bridge off from Saudi Arabia to Bahrain in response to these bridge strikes allowed the Bahraini people to overthrow the Al Khalifa monarchy there and really actually forced the Americans to completely pull out of the Kingdom of Bahrain, because that would likely be the easiest place to achieve that, probably followed by Kuwait. But I think that is something that if the Iranians are really taking this seriously, that's an obvious escalation that they need to undergo. So before I talk about Syria and Lebanon, Dmitri, what are your thoughts on Pakistan? These defense treaties, again, Pakistan, nuclear armed state. So potential sleeper here as far as first country to get involved in a nuclear way, as it seems that Pakistan has flipped against the Iranians and against the cause for peace. I'd like your thoughts on that, as well as, of course, Ansarallah, the situation at their airport and the closure of the Bab-el-Mandeb Straits, again, before we move on to the Levant. Hey, this is Conrad cutting in from a few hours in the future from when this was recorded. U.S. Central Command has announced that 2 American soldiers were killed in one of the Iranian missile strikes against Jordan, and 1 more soldier is currently missing in action. 4 soldiers were seriously injured and were evacuated to Jordanian hospitals for urgent treatment. The other soldier that's missing is being speculated that he was blown up so thoroughly that his remains were not recoverable. So American blood has been spilled. I believe in the episode of the recording, I speculated that both Jordan and Bahrain and potentially Kuwait had experienced actual U.S. deaths and major casualties, and they were simply being managed and eventually would be reported in the most beneficial way for the United States. So that is what is currently going on. The escalations are undoubtedly coming now, potentially much more soon. So this really is the big one. I believe the fuel shortages are coming. And as of right now, the United States Energy Information Agency has released data and information showing that the total crude oil inventories, including the strategic petroleum reserves, are at all-time lows. Again, there's nowhere on the graph going back decades really that shows it as this low. So we're getting ready to repeat 1973, the shortages there during the Carter era, as the chaos in the Middle East obviously expedited the major oil shortages. So that is what we're about to experience. At this point, I think it's unavoidable. And Iran is currently striking major Kuwaiti power and desalination plants. We recorded on the beginning of those strikes, but those are well underway. So expect American strikes across Iran on their civilian infrastructure, and expect potentially more Iranian strikes across the region on civilian infrastructure, and even leading to major UAE, Saudi, and other oil production facilities. So that's what's going on. Israel yet to enter the fight, but I'd wager that comes later this week. So the rest of the episode so far, the analysis has proven extremely prescient. So tap in and tune into the rest of the show. Thank you all so much.
I think firstly, Pakistan's perspective, really, it shouldn't be surprising to any listeners. We've mentioned over the past few weeks that Pakistan's primary position is not as an ally of Iran. I think Pakistan's relationship with Iran a lot of the time comes not just through the prism of the fact that they are neighbors, but because of their joint Chinese relationship, the animosity that they have potentially towards the Americans, somehow meddling in their domestic politics and their local issues that they had with the whole war in Afghanistan, the war on terror, and I think long-standing issues. But the Americans themselves have carried out joint operations with Pakistanis over the past 2 decades anyway in Afghanistan. So it's not necessarily like for the Iranians to understand that the Pakistanis are completely on their side. I think shouldn't be surprising that Pakistan essentially condemned any strikes against Saudi Arabia very early on this week. I think that should be, I think, somewhat expected, and Iran did almost anticipate. In some way, it's been good that Pakistan's position generally has not been anti-Iranian, but in fact has been pro-mediation, pro-peace talks, pro-conferencing. I think that's somewhat not surprising. I think that's the most neutral that we can see Pakistan becoming. There won't be any, of course, nuclear proliferation. I think any of these, you can almost call it tinfoil hat theories that Pakistan will be providing Iran of nuclear warheads, nuclear weaponry. I think those are completely out of the window, especially if you consider the US really heavily already scanning the southeastern portions of the connection between Pakistan and Iran. And that mechanized base that the Americans did hit this week was actually stationed right there in Sistan, Balochistan province, located on the borders of Pakistan and Iran. So it's already quite clear that the Americans are watching those areas very carefully. In relation to Ansarallah and the recent escalation of Saudi Arabia, I think the most surprising thing here is that it wasn't actually the Ansarallah and the Houthis who escalated on the behest of Iran. It was actually the official sort of Yemenis government, the official, I say this in parentheses, of course, but triple parentheses there I had. And of course, it was the official government in Yemen and the Saudis who escalated that entire position that led to the Abha International Airport in Saudi Arabia to be bombed. So people blaming, of course, Ansarallah comparing them to ISIS, etc., is completely inappropriate. In fact, the Sana'a airport receiving those Iranian flights, and those Iranian flights, by the way, just had basically Yemeni citizens. From what we understand, they had no weapons, no military drones, no shipments of equipment or intelligence from Iran. Yeah, sure, there could have been some Iranian IRGC agents or military advisors arriving to Sana'a International Airport, but those sort of covert exchanges happen all the time, and that's no excuse to bomb an international airport. I think that's completely unhinged, and I think Saudi Arabia did the correct thing by quickly attempting to de-escalate the situation. Very interesting that they had the Yemeni government essentially publicly proclaim that it was us who bombed the Sana'a airport. They took responsibility, and Saudi Arabia basically probably got their agents over there to completely take the blame onto themselves. But definitely the Bab-el-Mandeb escalation, I think if that does take place, Conrad, I think the Ansarallah strategy would probably be centered around, well, just keeping the Bab-el-Mandeb closed rather than engaging against both the Yemeni government, at least the supposed official government that unfortunately Russia sort of partially recognizes as well, and Saudi Arabia, not engaging those two particular forces whilst at the same time trying to keep the Bab-el-Mandeb closed. I think that's almost fighting a completely 360-degree war almost on all fronts for Ansarallah that may be taking a bite too big out of their enemies. And in fact, I think it should be more focused approach, especially if you just expect what might happen is, and this happened in 2025, and prior there was threats of essentially like a NATO coalition naval expedition through the Suez into the Red Sea in order to keep the Bab-el-Mandeb open. In fact, Trump may call on his European allies to become involved once again in a similar way to how they got involved in the Eastern Mediterranean when some sort of stray, allegedly Iranian drones were attempting to strike at British bases in Cyprus, things like this. In order to get Trump's allies on board, I think the Bab-el-Mandeb will be one of those points of ignition that will bring in the European navies, which haven't actually been actively involved in the Russo-Ukrainian war, unlike a lot of the mercenaries that they've been sending in. And they've been somewhat, they do need, I suppose, a bit of practice after the destruction of Libya. So in fact, it wouldn't be too surprising if the Bab-el-Mandeb, Conrad, led to further involvement of other EU, NATO-based powers in bringing them into the conflict almost by force, by essentially saying that, look, the Bab-el-Mandeb being closed will essentially cause a huge economic downturn in all of Europe, which was already suffering heavily from the gas shortages coming out of Russia and all the issues related to the Blue Stream, the Druzhba pipeline, etc., and of course the Nord Stream being shut down. So all of this will lead to potentially more European involvement in that, in the Hijaz area, and that I think is not something that Iran or Ansarallah would want to happen, but they may not even have a choice because, again, their options are somewhat limited as to what they can do in sort of engaging in this conflict. Just wanted to mention briefly, Conrad, moving to other areas of the Middle East, it's quite clear that there is some sort of, rhetorically speaking, some sort of proxy war almost being planned by the Kurds. There's no doubt the Iranians have been carrying out these continuous strikes on Kurdistan territories. And just for distance comparison, Kurdistan is a lot closer to some of Iran's major cities than even the southern coastal territories of Bushehr and Bandar Abbas. So in some ways, the issue of the Kurds and those armed militias actually entering into Iran and facing off against the official Iranian military and the IRGC is almost a larger threat to larger portions of the Iranian population than anything that the US is doing in the south related to the Straits of Hormuz. And this is maybe why the bulk of the Iranian army is now stationed somewhat, and we can, again, speculatively on the western side of the country. I mean, this is exactly those areas that were in fact attacked by Saddam Hussein back in the, all those decades ago. And these are particularly those areas of high sensitivity because, again, they touch upon Iran's actual sovereignty and further, I would say, power influence further into the Middle East, and you get into the Iraqi militias and their connections to Iran. And recently there was that shipment being seized across Syria of allegedly 100 Iranian drones being seized on the way to arm Hezbollah, seized of course by the HTS-led al-Shara al-Jilani government in Syria. And it does sort of highlight the issues that have emerged since the fall of the Bashar al-Assad government in December of 2024, where the axis of resistance essentially was cut in half, and Hezbollah is well and truly now surrounded by its enemies, cut off from perhaps its main ally and sponsor in the face of Iran, and now they're facing perhaps even some logistical shortages because of that. And in fact, the recent, Iraq basically taking the side of the GCC states, having almost an official position. Iraq, naturally, as we look at it now, is almost like a no man's land territory where you have these basically lots of power players involved in their particular conflict. The Kurds, you have the Iraqi militias, you do have some remnants of ISIS still roaming around, especially in the deserts in the west of the country. It is a particularly sensitive spot that I think Iran is very fixated on, incorrectly so. If there will be an inland invasion into Iran, it probably won't be happening from the south, through those desert territories. Most likely it'll happen, unfortunately, from the west, and most likely to be led by those Kurdish proxies that the Americans and the Israelis have been training and preparing for decades now. And unfortunately, I think it's quite sad to see the sort of Turkish-backed and GCC-backed HTS regime in Syria really take a strong anti-Iranian position. It's not surprising for us, not surprising to a lot of our listeners, but to sort of see Iran essentially be almost like a crescent from the north to the south, entirely surrounded by enemies, with almost no allies on that end, and only to the east do they have, somewhat trading partners and economic support from countries like Pakistan and China. It really leaves Iran in an extremely precarious situation. And again, what does that spell for the future of Hezbollah? And you just mentioned the numbers of Ansarallah fighters, but Hezbollah most likely is even less in number than the total forces of Ansarallah in Yemen. And it is quite interesting to see exactly how Israel is conducting itself, and why exactly is Iran at the moment providing that, maybe even ballistic support, shall we call it, to Hezbollah, which is now experiencing, again, that prolonged genocide south of the Litani River, which is currently ongoing. It's been happening for several months now, since the Purim War has commenced. Hezbollah, the only reason Hezbollah even recommenced bombing Israel this year, we know, is because Ali Khamenei and the leaders of Iran were attacked directly by Israel and the United States. So what does that necessarily spell for Iran's involvement? As you said, I think the logical thing to do here would be to threaten Israel openly now, to actually request for them to leave those areas south of the Litani. And Joseph Aoun is certainly not achieving that. And there is a constant pressure, I think, on the independent, patriots of Lebanon to force the invaders out. But without Iran's support, will they actually be able to do that? That is the big question mark that has, again, sort of reinforced itself. And it's really quite sad to see how the enemies of Iran in the GCC states, the US and Israel, have used this divide and conquer tactic to actually break up the axis of resistance, to isolate them, and again to pressure them on multiple fronts, to actually force them to potentially make mistakes, make diplomatic errors, and take out their leadership structures over the last few years since October 7th. It's really sort of a state-of-the-art example of how that can be done to a particular region. And I think the war currently, Conrad, as it stands, will definitely be very heavily centered around what will happen south of the Litani River, especially if somehow the situation calms down in the Straits of Hormuz. The point of ignition will always be the suffering of the Lebanese people. That is something the Iranians, I think, will not close their eyes upon, and they will retaliate eventually, and there will be this re-engagement of the Israelis. But you're right, the Israeli Air Force is it's extremely powerful, much stronger than any singular Gulf state country. And the Israeli pilots, they've been training, unfortunately, to hitting stationary civilian targets all over Gaza for the last few years. They've been striking at Syria since 2024 quite actively, over hundreds of bombing raids over Syrian arms depots and other so-called Hezbollah-related targets. So the Israeli Air Force is well and truly trained, it's battle-hardened, it's experienced, and I think Iran is somewhat hesitant in terms of getting involved. And there's still no guarantees of, for example, Russian Sukhoi planes being delivered to Iran. We don't have any data on where exactly those Russian fighter jets are located, if they even arrived in Iran. And speaking about that, by the way, we did see some Russian planes, some VIP government planes. These are not, of course, Russian AWACS. These are not Beriev A-50s or A-100s or even like Ilyushin Il-22s. That's one of the planes that Prigozhin shot down in June of 2023. It's not none of these like military major surveillance planes, but there were VIP government Russian planes which could have had Ministry of Defense personnel on them, as well as top Russian diplomats. They did arrive in Tehran this week. That's the Russian Tu-14 PU plane, of course, as well as an Antonov AN-148 and some other planes arrived in Tehran at the Ali Khamenei International Airport. So there has been some movement by the Russians, but none of this incredible sort of support that we perhaps initially expected. In a way, maybe the Russians are still pushing, at least mistakenly so, pushing for Iran to engage in diplomacy with its enemies. And that's almost as comical as if Iran would say Russia absolutely needs to engage in peace talks with Ukraine, as simply not understanding the situations on the ground. And of course, that war itself is ever escalating. So again, the plight of the Lebanese people, I think, is just something that just simply the Iranians will not be ignoring, especially those patriots who've been around who understand that the only reason Lebanese people are dying is because, again, they stood up for their neighbor in faith, so to speak, their Persian brothers all across the Middle East. And that's why the Hezbollah has become involved very heavily in this year, in 2026. So Iran, I think, should definitely at least begin anticipating some sort of retaliation strike against Israel in the coming weeks or months, especially if the U.S. is not going to be backing down.
100%. And you mentioned Russia and Iran. And of course, you'd hope that Iran has pilots that have been in Russia for several years now, hopefully training on some of these planes. So if they do get an expedited delivery of these Sukhoi planes and these other advanced fighter jets from Russia, that they'd actually be able to use them very quickly. But, these systems are very hard to integrate. But again, the Russians demanding negotiations, do they not realize that Iran, by degrading the air defense and forcing the replenishment of these Patriot missiles and destroying these Patriot batteries and these HIMARS batteries in Kuwait and Jordan and these other places, they are helping Russia more than anybody else? I mean, Ukraine is now running out of Patriot missiles. The U.S. can't replenish them because they're moving them all to the Middle East. So again, why Russia is moving for negotiations here, I don't see any other reason why other than influence from the Talmudic tribe. I mean, again, they have stopped exports and diesel and stuff, so they are no longer benefiting quite as much from the closure of the Strait of Hormuz economically because of the strikes on energy infrastructure that we'll talk about in a second. But regardless, it's a bit disappointing to see. But you, of course, mentioned the situation in Syria as they seized that arms shipment that didn't just include drones. It included long-range missiles, rockets, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of drones. It was concealed inside one of the oil tanker trucks that was headed to the city of Banias, discovered during routine inspection procedures at the Al-Tanf border crossing between Syria and Iraq after customs officers subjected the vehicle to a thorough search. So maybe the Al-Tanf strikes, supposedly by Iran, or maybe a signal about this. It says here, according to the ministry, preliminary investigations based on evidence collected at the scene indicated that the shipment was intended to transit Syrian territory before being delivered to the Hezbollah terrorist militia in Lebanon, Sana'a wrote, citing sources from Syria's interior ministry. The Iran-backed Lebanese group denied having any activity in Syria. Following the seizure, Iraq said it would form a high-level committee to investigate what happened. The military's Joint Operations Command said Baghdad would coordinate with Syrian authorities to establish the circumstances of the attempted smuggling. And of course, we already discussed the Iraqi sanctions against Lebanese Hezbollah. So Trump obviously has been pressuring al-Jawlani al-Shura not just to shut down these supply routes from Iran through Iraq, through Syria into Lebanon, but he actually wants Syria to be the main force taking on Hezbollah. This is from New Arab. It says, U.S. President Trump has once again suggested that Syria should take on Hezbollah in Lebanon, saying President Ahmed al-Shara would be more precise than Israel in confronting the group and would do so without knocking down buildings. Not knocking down buildings, just chopping off more heads, probably. He says, speaking to Fox News on Tuesday, Trump was asked about a statement he made last month in which he said the Syrian forces could fight Hezbollah. Shara at the time ruled out any intervention in Lebanon against the group. However, Trump doubled down on his suggestion regardless. He would go in and take care of Hezbollah, and he'd do it in a different way. He wouldn't knock down buildings. I hated to see buildings knocked down. When asked if he thought Shara would be more precise than Hezbollah, Trump replied, I think he'd be more precise, yeah, and I think I know he'd like to do it. He said he was thinking about giving Syrian president a green light to intervene in Lebanon against the group. Trump's plan for intervention in Lebanon is unpopular in Syria. However, Syrian observer had previously told the New Arab that it would be stupid to get involved in Lebanon, partly because of the sectarian dynamics involved. There's no way the Syrian government is going to do that. You can criticize Ahmed al-Shara for a lot of things, but he isn't stupid, and you would have to be stupid to do what Trump is talking about. Syrian author Rabin Yassin Kassab told the New Arab last month. Syrians are also exhausted by years-long conflict in their country, which has destroyed much of its infrastructure. Hezbollah intervened in Syria during the conflict to support the regime of former dictator Bashar al-Assad, who was overthrown in December 2024. Of course, Hezbollah was there fighting ISIS and whatnot. So, unfortunate situations in Syria. I don't know if, again, al-Jawlani will be offered enough cheese somehow to be able to go into Lebanon. He's rejected it so far, but obviously we have to watch that situation closely. But the Israelis, again, they're in there regardless, and they refuse to leave. We have this from Lebanese President Joseph Ayoun. This is reported by Al Mayadeen. He told President Trump that any future agreement with Israel must include a complete Israeli military withdrawal, not only from Lebanese territory, but also from neighboring Syria. Ayoun argued that the security of Lebanon and Syria is closely linked. He also accused Israel of exacerbating tensions in both states. So obviously, I think Ayoun, he's saying this to possibly prevent, maybe Syrian intervention, and of course to seem more strong, because undoubtedly domestic opinion in Lebanon is turning against him, and they're realizing, hey, how about instead of signing agreements that promise that the Lebanese armed forces are going to be used to disarm Hezbollah, what if the Lebanese armed forces fought alongside Hezbollah resisting Israel? Because Hezbollah is able to resist them pretty well so far. Maybe we'd be able to win if the Lebanese armed forces joined up. But, that's an anti-Semitic thought or something, right? And of course, in the midst of all of this, according to Mariv, Israeli media, IDF forces have begun constructing a line of permanent outposts in southern Lebanon, a move that could potentially lead to tensions between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz also informed the U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth that the IDF will remain in Lebanon, Syria, and Gaza in the midst of all of this. So this is all in the past 2 days that this has been stated. So Israel continues to make Lebanon a major issue, like you mentioned, Dmitri, for Iran and for the United States. And of course, Syria, because the U.S. and Israel are there as well, is now getting dragged in too. So World War III is in full effect, and you start to see how Russia coming down in through Syria, and Israel versus Turkey, and Turkey getting involved. All these different things that the prophecies sort of indicate about are coming together. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second here. But in Israel, domestically speaking, we are obviously facing a very relevant turning point. The Knesset was dissolved on a 62-0 vote just in the past few days, and it will not resume again until after elections in October. And just last month, the Vatopedi Center for Public Opinion and Policy Research at the Israel Democracy Institute, based in occupied Jerusalem, released a poll revealing that most Israelis do not want Netanyahu to run in the upcoming election. According to the results, 61% of Israelis believe Netanyahu should not run in the elections. 35% were in favor of the current premier running. Netanyahu remains mired in a years-long criminal trial over corruption and other scandals. The trial has seen near constant delays. The prime minister has also failed to resolve the Haredi draft crisis plaguing Israel, with ultra-Orthodox Jews still avoiding conscription and opposition parties criticizing the ruling coalition for placing secular reservists at the forefront of the conflict. As a result of this crisis, Israeli army leadership has warned of a collapse in the reserves. Earlier in 2026, the crisis prompted calls for early elections and Knesset dissolution. In May, the Times of Israel reported that Netanyahu and his coalition put forward their own Knesset dissolution bill in order to control both the legislative process and the timing of the vote. While the opposition accuses Netanyahu of corruption, it has also charged the premier with mishandling the brutal wars in Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. Many of these opposition parties hold similar views to those currently serving in the Israeli government, particularly on issues related to attacks and occupation in Lebanon and Gaza, as well as military action against Iran. Bennett and other opposition figures complained earlier this year that the Lebanese capital was not bombed hard enough, stemming from frustration over the severe losses inflicted on Tel Aviv's forces by Hezbollah's campaign of FPV drone strikes. And of course, the Israelis, for them, a major Jewish holiday is coming up. Of course, the Purim War started all of this that is now renewed. And Wednesday, July 23rd on sundown Wednesday, July 22nd, sundown through Thursday, July 23rd is Tisha B'av, which is the saddest day, Jewish day of mourning, as it were, of the fall of the temple in 70 AD, the destruction of it by Emperor Titus, of course, the looting of their temple commemorated on the Arch of Titus in Rome. And of course, we think about this, we think of what may come of this. And of course, as the war with Iran has escalated again, and any day now Israel could begin their strikes and Iran could begin strikes on Israel, we have to wonder, will they use this opportunity to potentially either do something crazy on their own as far as escalations go? But St. Paisios here talked about this, of course, the destruction of the Mosque of Omar, the rebuilding of the Third Temple. This is prophesied by many Orthodox saints. And this is here, I'm reading from the Eschatological Visions of the Blessed. St. Paisios said, "A devout Jordanian told me that the Jews have already dug tunnels deep beneath the dome of the rock. They want to destroy it in order to build Solomon's temple, because they believe that only then will their Messiah, the Antichrist, come. At that time, the Arabs will turn to the Christians and say, 'Don't you Christians say that the Messiah has already come? What are these Jews talking about now?'" And so, again, we've already seen supposed Iranian strikes, or what was more likely a supposed misfire from a Patriot air defense system in Israel, misfire and strike the plaza near the Mosque of Omar, the Dome of the Rock. So potentially Tisha B'av, this Jewish day of mourning for the fall of the Second Temple, perhaps something in regards to the Dome of the Rock and the Third Temple will occur there if there are strikes and Israel really enters this conflict. And of course, when it comes to the prophecies, we would be remiss not to talk about the big man himself, Erdogan. Of course, he returned to Turkey after his condolences visit to Qatar. This is from AA again. It says Turkish President Erdogan returned to Turkey on Tuesday after traveling to Qatar to offer condolences over the death of former Qatari Emir Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani. Erdogan arrived in the capital, Ankara, aboard the presidential aircraft and was received at Ankara Esenboga Airport by Vice President Cevdet Yilmaz, Presidential Secretary General Haki Susmat, Ankara Governor Yakub Kombalat, and other officials, yada yada. So, of course, many people were speculating on, maybe Erdogan would get taken down in his plane as early as, this week in this trip to Qatar. But, of course, most of the recent warnings from the elders in that regard have been about him flying back from Syria or flying back from Libya and whatnot. And, of course, the Libya situation is very much currently in flux. This is from the Jerusalem Post. It says 6 years after fueling conflict, Turkey repositions itself as a peace broker in Libya. It says in May 2020, Turkish media reported that Libyan forces had retaken a key airbase and ended Haftar's coup plot. And of course, in this week, at the end of June and the beginning of July, Turk's intelligence chief Ibrahim Kalin met with Lieutenant General Saddam Haftar, Deputy General of the Libyan National Army. And this meeting, 6 years after 2020, represents a major change. Turkey shifted from its involvement in fueling the conflict in Libya and stoking flames of tension in the eastern Mediterranean to trying to broker some kind of peace in the region. Critics of Ankara will say Turkey's leadership is merely putting a mask and continues to retain its regional ambitions. The reality is that both can be true. Turkey has regional ambitions in Libya, but it now sees accommodation and dialogue as more important than weapons. Turkey and America, they might be coming together, getting the Benghazi and Tripoli-based governments together again. And again, maybe it would be so momentous as to facilitate an Erdogan trip potentially to Libya, which again, if he gets shot down over Libya, think about where that could be. It could be over the island of Crete, where we recently saw Greek-Israeli joint aerial exercises. And you think about it, Erdogan shot down over Crete. Turkey has a crisis of government. The military immediately responds, invades several Greek islands. And next thing you know, a Kemalist comes to power. Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits are closed to the Russians. This really isn't so fantastical to say. If I had mapped that out when we started this show in 2022, people would have called me crazy. But here we are 4 years later, and it seems like a not so unlikely phenomenon. And just this past week, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan visited Kiev and declared that after the end of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Turkey will join the security guarantees for Ukraine and will be responsible for their part concerning the Black Sea regarding security collaboration. And of course, just this week, Greece blocked the EU's 21st sanctions package against Russia because it proposed a ban on transporting Russian LNG to third countries would severely hurt Dynagas, a Greek shipping company that specializes in Arctic LNG transport. Athens argues the company's highly specialized ice-breaking LNG carriers cannot easily be repurposed, while other EU members say all countries have had to sacrifice businesses to maintain pressure on Moscow. The dispute has delayed the entire sanctions package, including new measures targeting Russian banks, military firms, and the oil price cap. So again, you factor all of this in together. You see Turkey moving closer and closer to Ukraine. You see Israel moving against Turkey more and more. You see Russia, being forced more to align with Iran against Israel. The puzzle pieces all start to fall into place for where the prophecies are going. And of course, this is our final episode before the final section of the E65 hot motorway is completed on July 23rd. Of course, on July 20th, the Feast of St. Elias will pass, which is what many of these elders and eldresses have been talking about. Yerandisa on Cyprus said that on July 8th of 2026, Turkey, the hour has come, you must depart, it will be sudden, the Virgin Mary will step in front. It says, before the feast of the prophet Elijah, we must repent, although repentance is always timeless. In the Yerandisa's words, now it becomes urgent. And of course, that's on July 20th. So again, this is our last show before these dates pass. It's likely the day the show is actually going to be released, July 20th, Sunday. So there's another simultaneous, or rather Monday, July 20th would be the 19th. There's another simultaneous piece of information that was given to Dr. Konstantinos Varadakas last night by his friend Elias, the teacher, a spiritual child of an Athenite elder, himself a spiritual child of saintly Elder Ephraim of Arizona. received information from two of his own spiritual children who don't know each other. The Panagia appeared to them and said, "Now are the events." We've also heard that Elder Ephraim appeared to some spiritual children of his and the fathers of Philotheo that the Turks are coming. So this really is getting close here. And this is from a Greek news outlet. It says the E65 motorway, one of Greece's key national road infrastructure projects, will be completed in full with the opening of its final section between Kalimbaka and Grevena on Thursday, July 23rd, 2026. The official inauguration will be attended by the Prime Minister and the political leadership of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Transport. With the completion of the northern section, the E65 reaches a total length of approximately 182 kilometers, connecting Lamia to Ignatia Odos near Grevena. The motorway establishes a new, faster vertical axis in the national road network, strengthening connectivity between central Greece and Thessaly with Western Macedonia. It also ultimately connects to national roadway networks leading all the way up through Poland through the European Union. So you have to think about this. So July 19th, July 20th, we have the Feast of St. Elias. July 23rd, we have the completion of the E65 highway. July 22nd, 23rd is also Tisha B'av, the Jewish day of mourning over the collapse of the temple. So again, this is all starting to come together. And I mentioned at the beginning the prophecy / predictions / warnings of Abbott. He has been saying now in about 7 to 8 weeks, apparently he's been saying this in the past few days, the next 7 to 8 weeks, the fuel will run out. America will be experiencing fuel shortages. There will be sort of economic crisis as well. He talks about how prisoners won't be able to be fed or taken care of in the prisons. They'll be turned loose. There will be civil unrest, sort of, almost said it was potentially going to be like BLM or something on, I think that was the person telling me this, speculated that's what he thought it sounded like. But he said there would be unrest, there would be these fuel shortages. And of course, if that's going down in America, I assume it would be because, of course, the Strait of Hormuz is remaining closed and the energy shocks that we'll be experiencing. And now that, of course, the strategic reserve of America and all these other countries has been so depleted, we're going to actually experience the hard energy shocks. Compounded, of course. I mean, some of it would just be, basic fallout from the delays earlier this year. And now, of course, that the strait is closed again, it's going to just be compounding all of that. So really, kind of incredible warning here from a local elder that we have. So if that means anything, everyone sort of start preparing, make sure you're praying, repenting. A lot of people are saying they're buying RVs or other mobile homes so they can pack up and go to the closest monastery. Of course, I know I'm close to my monastery, so not too worried about that, but I'm undoubtedly going to be stocking up on ammunition, some other important supplies, water purification. Some people are talking about ways to mix and preserve fuel and store fuel. And, diesel apparently is much easier to store. So people are talking about diesel vehicles, all sorts of other things. But, we're having Father Peter Hears on Ether Hour next week. So subscribe to World War Now, get behind that paywall to catch the recent episodes, of course, with Dr. David Patrick Harry, but also to get prepared for our episode with Father Peter Hears. I'm sure he will be able to give us more details about what all the Athonite fathers have been telling us is on the horizon here, because many elders who have never talked about current events or prophecies or anything are suddenly now talking about the Turks and the highway and what's going on with Israel and Iran. And of course, Greece did extend the limit of their old ID cards until September 2027, apparently. But in the next few months, still certain people like in the military and other public workers, just in the next few months, are going to be completely forced to get the new ID cards that, of course, St. Paisios warns about. Listen to our episode with David Patrick Harry. We talk more about that. But the new ID cards were extensively warned about from St. Paisios, and they're going to have to do with EU travel and getting your paychecks and your pensions and Social Security, and even just being able to travel around at all within Greece. They're consolidating all of one's cards, medical information, financial, and all these other things. And St. Paisios warns that this, of course, is a precursor to the mark of the beast and the total Antichrist control system. So it says here, of course, by September 2027, old IDs will be fully withdrawn from public transactions, and citizens will need the new national identity card for all dealings with authorities. So not an ideal situation at all. And again, maybe because they've pushed this back a little bit, we will see some of these disasters pushed back into 2027. But again, I've been saying for a while, I think Dmitri and I started saying it in 2024, 2025, that 2026, 2027 really seems to be the year that is going to tell the tales. As we are recording this, of course, there are new Iranian strikes on Kuwait. So obviously that continues to escalate. And another factor, again, that is leading me to sort of dissect all of this prophetic literature and all of these prophecies as to this exact moment. And again, some of it's just blatant warnings telling us that we're in the midst of this. But it seems right now that the Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis of Greece is leaning towards going to the polls, having Greek elections either September 27th or October 4th. So very similar timeline to Israeli elections. And of course, St. Paisio's prophecies and many others talk about how in the midst of the fall of Erdogan, this crisis, the invasion of the Greek islands like Crete, for example, which apparently, there are energy, and gas and oil fields off the coast of Crete that the Turks are going to try to seize when they take parts of Crete. The Greek and Cypriot forces apparently are going to ultimately resist in some of those areas. The prophecies talk about there being a brief sort of ethnic cleansing and warfare on Cyprus before the Turks are forced to pull out. But of course, in the midst of all of this, if the Turks are occupying Rhodes, Lesbos, Crete, these places, there will be a crisis of government. Perhaps if there were already elections going on, and the government refuses to defend the population, this would make more sense. But the prophecies say that there will be sort of an uprising, there will be unrest, the people will sort of kick out the corrupt politicians, and it won't be, a new party or something that rises up. It will sort of be a new group of patriots or people from the military or something, or again, as we say on the show, potentially St. John Vatatzis, as the prophecies discuss, who knows? But that is just another one of those signs that points to the prophecies continually being fulfilled, and many of these prophecies being fulfilled at once, whether it comes to the E65 highway, the 2026 Feast of St. Elias, of course, the situation in Russia and Turkey and Ukraine and the Black Sea, as Turkey slowly but surely lurches that direction, the ID cards, the elections, the situation in Libya. So again, as we've been saying for a long time now, the number one sign that we're watching very closely here is the fall of Erdogan. And we don't really know, will an American ground operation on the southern coast of Iran occur before the fall of Erdogan? Right now, it potentially seems more likely. But if the hypothesis that he will be shot down from Syria or Libya or somewhere else, then of course the fall of Erdogan will truly be the ultimate black swan, shocking event that will really kick all of this into high gear. So I'd love your thoughts on all of this, Dmitri, on what's going on in Greece and Turkey and with the highway and everything. I'd love your perspective on all of this before we move on to Russia, Ukraine. Of course, the Greek blocking of the Russian sanctions, the Turks, collaborating more with the Ukrainians in the Black Sea. So much to discuss here.
Certainly. And of course, the situation, the attitudes towards the Greco-Turkish conflict, I think, have been somewhat left out of scope entirely in the mainstream media. There's almost like, especially given this NATO summit recently taking place in Turkey, it's almost Trump is trying to display this NATO unity whilst obviously there's a major crisis going on amidst America's allies in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's very clear that Turkey and Greece do not see eye to eye, despite being in the same defensive military alliance of NATO. It's very clear that America's ally of Israel, which isn't a part of NATO, but is literally the greatest ally, defensively speaking, of the United States, is projecting itself onto Turkey, blaming Turkey for supporting Islamism, be it Hamas, be it HTS, the regime in Damascus, against which Israel is expanding into Syria. It's very clear that there is a major conflict brewing, which inevitably, I think, will lead the Russian Federation to become involved. And of course, I think that involvement will be centered around I think the economic aspects of what's happening with the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, the greater world market that the Russian Federation is, I think without a doubt involved in. And this is probably why, historically speaking, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, this choke point of warm, unfreezing seas trade has always been so central to Russia throughout its history. And very clearly, this is one of the main hubs for the slave trade hundreds of years ago that the Russians, of course, over the hundreds of years of their expansion southwards, geopolitically speaking, they have tried to shut down from the Turks. It was always a super sensitive position. What would happen if the Bosphorus and Dardanelles would be shut down for Russian access to the Adriatic, to the greater Eastern Mediterranean, to these Greek islands, to the greater oceans of the world? This is a key issue. And I mean, arguably speaking, even other conflicts which may seem unrelated, for example, the Russo-Japanese War, that was clearly directed at the fact that Tsar Nicholas II did not want a prolonged war of the Ottoman Empire, so he wanted warm sea ports somewhere else where he didn't have to engage against the Caliphate and its allies and sponsors, be it certain European powers. And Tsar Nicholas II wanted to expand into warm sea ports, maybe out in the Pacific Ocean, for example. But again, the powers that be funded the rising Meiji Japanese Empire, and again, the Rothschild-based creditors, of course, built up the Japanese Navy, and that, of course, stopped Russian progression there in the Far East. And now, of course, unfortunately, Russia's left with this current Russo-Ukrainian conflict, which again, now, Conrad, on an unprecedented scale, is actually impacting economic trade of Russia and Ukraine both jointly. And this is probably the craziest news coming out of the conflict, because if you look at the frontline progress, Russia's still taking Kupiansk, for example. They're still fighting at Kupiansk-Kozlovoy. Literally 2.5, 3 months ago, we had General Gerasimov, the leader of the Russian armed forces, telling us that Kupiansk was taken. That's clearly not the case. The Russians are, land-wise, progressing very, very adamantly through the Donetsk Oblast. They're currently between 5 and 6 kilometers to the east of Kramatorsk, the major city that they need to take from the Ukrainians into Donetsk People's Republic, this major stronghold that the Ukrainians have been occupying for over 12 years now. The Russians are again pushing closer to that territory, over maybe 10 kilometers away from Slavyansk, 11, 12 kilometers away from Svyatogorsk-Lavra to the north, west of Slavyansk, and again, from the south, of course, taking Konstantinovka entirely, and now moving on to Druzhkovka. The Russians are basically closing in on their sort of prize that they've been focused on this entire time. And the Ukrainians, their strategy of throwing thousands of drones per day at the Russians, with hundreds of those drones being shot down, it doesn't seem to be slowing down the Russian war machine. And the war machine hasn't really even tapped into further reserves of mobilizations yet. And potentially that there's a certain tactic there, because we have to just keep in mind, it's not just the prophecies that spell out a greater Russian war and the need for Russian manpower to be used in war against Turkey, but also there are Russian geopolitical analysts, and for whatever reason, even the Hawks and the Dubs, people like Pavel Gubaryov, they've been predicting a greater Russo-NATO war coming in the future. They said Russia will be fighting against NATO by 2028 at the very least, and these are incredibly dangerous foretellings of major Russian political commentators, including Igor Strelkov as well, for example. Now, I do want to mention, a Russian war against NATO may not necessarily mean Russia, for example, enters into the Baltics, which I think will happen just by default. It may not mean Russia begins bombing Germany or Poland, but certainly a Russian war against NATO may involve Turkey here directly. The most interesting thing is, obviously, Hakan Fidan's visit to Kiev amidst the intensifying Ukrainian bombing of the Russian commercial vessels in the Sea of Azov. This is important. So Russia has several port cities in the Sea of Azov. The Sea of Azov is a very, how do I say this? It's a very strange sea. It's very shallow. It has quite several ports located on both coasts, both the, so to speak, the Ukrainian mainland coast and the Russian mainland coast. It has been basically this safe haven throughout the war. Unmolested, unchecked, the Russian commercial vessels have been able to travel from Azov to the Black Sea through the Kerch Straits almost unharassed by the Ukrainians. And there was this unspoken agreement that many Russian commentators have pointed out, that Ukraine and Russia basically said, look, we'll have this war on the land, but do not touch either country will not touch any agricultural or fertilizer exports, and we'll just continue to go at it on the front lines of the special military operation, which again leads to thousands of people dead, but we will not be touching either side's economic interest. That, I think, has come to an end this week. For the first time, we had Ukrainian drones hitting and targeting, according to Ukrainian sources, as many as 12 Russian commercial ships, which again, they labeled them as Russian shadow fleet vessels, which again is insane. The Russia has been openly trading through the Black Sea this entire time. They don't need to be parts of these shadow fleets, so to speak. They might as well be flying the Russian flag. They still are not legitimate targets. So just as the US and Iran are targeting commercial vessels and civilian vessels in the Straits of Hormuz, now Ukraine has targeted at least this week 12 vessels in the Black Sea. Also, the Sea of Azov has an unnumbered, again, you cannot legally even take photographs of these vessels stationed in the Sea of Azov, because you may be facing fines or prison sentences in the Russian Federation. But apparently there are major ports being targeted around the Sea of Azov by Ukrainian drone attacks and maybe long-range missiles. There aren't any concrete reports about that, but photograph footage, of course, has been surfacing every now and then. We do see some evidence of increased Ukrainian attacks. Clearly, they want to disrupt Russian agricultural fertilizer exports, wheat, grain exports, and other goods that Russia, again, heavily depends upon. Like a third of Russia's trade leaves those ports located on the Azov and the Black Sea. This is crucial for the Russian economy. And again, for the Ukrainian economy as well, because they have 5 ports overall, 1 in Kherson, 1 in the city of Nikolaev, and 3 ports located in the Odessa Oblast. And the largest port, we can say, just south of the city of Odessa, called the Chernomorsk, the Black Sea port, basically, has in fact been hit perhaps in retaliation by the Russians. The Russians took out an entire cargo vessels. They've completely disabled it while it was stationed in the port. Ukrainians are reporting huge losses of agricultural exports this week. Over a third of the grain that Ukraine was supposed to export has been apparently lost. There's major power outages taking place at Chernomorsk. The Russians have openly retaliated against Ukraine's economic interests as a response to the fact that Ukraine is carrying out what Lavrov himself, the Russian foreign minister, has described as essentially terrorist strikes. He made an interesting analogy. If you recall, Donald J. Trump, I think earlier this year, called himself a pirate. He's like, we are like pirates now. Maybe a reference to the Pirates of the Caribbean or something quite novel and trivial, but obviously it came off quite crude. Lavrov said the Ukrainians are worse than pirates. He said at least pirates would steal goods and not destroy them, and at least try to redistribute them in some thievish bandit-style way. But the Ukrainians simply want to destroy Russian goods as they transit out of the country into the greater world markets. And that's exactly what, again, the Ukrainians have began sort of pushing the conflict towards. And Lavrov has called the Ukrainian state terroristic. Now, again, Lavrov, why are we surprised here? Ukraine has killed many civilians over the course of this conflict, engaged in terrorism domestically in major cities of Russia, including St. Petersburg and Moscow. They've killed civilians. They've killed Russian generals, Russian political, journalistic leaders, people with huge followings, people who have garnered support on social media in order to demoralize the greater Russian population. Why are we surprised that Ukraine is suddenly now striking out against civilian and maritime targets? Again, this should not be pausing Russia's push forward to liberate the special military operation zones, at the very least, these constitutional areas. And frankly, kudos to Russia for actually not slowing down despite the attacks of Ukraine against their rear targets. Now, a positive thing that has happened for Russia, however, this week, Conrad, and this shows you the shortage of Patriot missile interceptors within Ukraine, and this maybe reflects what's happening in the Middle East, as the GCC states perhaps are receiving the majority of the Patriot interceptor imports from America, is that it's for the first time we've had essentially 2 straight weeks of pretty much every single Russian long-range ballistic missile, be it a Kinzhal, being an Iskander, hitting the targets almost dead on within Ukraine itself. There's major parts of Kiev that are on fire. Russia's strikes against essentially these quasi-urban locations of drone productions within Kiev have been incredibly effective. And perhaps, part of the effectiveness of Ukraine, essentially, of Russia's strikes against Ukraine, and the fact that the Ukrainian government seemingly is completely surprised. They do want to build domestic Patriot missile interceptor factories within Ukraine. Well, I have to say that is good luck. If you construct a factory of that sort, I'm sure the Russians will no doubt use their Zircon hypersonic missiles to take those out. Those would be completely legitimate targets, even if they are staffed with, for example, NATO personnel or Lockheed Martin employees, or whomever is going to be constructing those Patriot missile interceptors. They better be masqueraded quite well somewhere on the far western fringes of the Ukrainian mainland. But in Ukraine, there was significant upheaval. Perhaps this is worth commenting on. The Ukrainian defense minister, and this is the 4th defense minister since the beginning of the war, has officially been pushed out of power by Zelensky himself. Of course, we're speaking about Mikhailo Fyodorov. He was defense minister for just under 6 months, or I believe just below 6 months. He was a 35-year-old defense minister. Formerly, again, he was a specialist in the digital realm. He was the minister of digital transformation of Ukraine. So this is, basically a Ukrainian millennial. He was apparently a specialist in drone warfare, although there's no real confirmation of that. So he was allegedly the architect of Ukraine's approach to defending itself against the Russian onslaught by imploring this almost excessive use of drones rather than on-the-ground military pushes against the Russian forces in the special military operation zones. And so Zelensky has basically fired his defense minister. And we do know from Ukraine, even within Ukraine itself, there are obviously these debates online and reports that Mikhail Fyodorov, the former defense minister, he openly had something against the head of the Ukrainian military, Syrsky. So they were very much at odds. And some Russian analysts like Maxim Kalashnikov and Lev Vershilin have pointed out that perhaps Zelensky has fired his defense minister in order to prevent a Prigozhin-type situation within Ukraine, where you would have Syrsky in the role of Prigozhin, essentially turning a portion of the Ukrainian military, going into Kiev and taking out his own defense minister, who would be this new Shoigu-type figure. And so at the moment, the acting defense minister, whilst they're in the selection process, is currently Yevgeny Komara, who is also the head of the basically the CIA of Ukraine, the SBU. So Yevgeny Komara is acting for both the SBU and the defense ministry in Ukraine. So there's big big shuffles going on within the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, within the executive branch. Zelensky is clearly trying to coordinate his way out of this. Of course, the attention given to Ukraine and Zelensky has taken a back seat to the fact that the Middle Eastern war has opened up well and truly this week, and I think Zelensky is well and truly crying out for that support, which I'm not sure if he'll be receiving from America, but certainly those NATO, European Union states are still well and truly very heavily invested in Ukraine, rather than, again, putting their attention towards Iran. And that, I think, is the big difference here in terms of who supports who in this particular conflict. So it is quite curious. Obviously, the previous defense minister, Shmigal, or Umerov, obviously the happy merchant, and Reznikov, again, also a Talmudic Jewish name. Reznik is like a very famous name in the Pale of Settlement, is somebody like a rabbi who, would perform circumcisions and other things. So all these particular characters in the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine have been basically responsible for sending young men to their deaths. So I'm not necessarily too aggrieved by the fact that, another person has left that particular post. Unfortunately for Ukraine, and this is what's really curious, is that there are protesters on the streets protesting against the firing of the defense minister. But notice, no one's protesting about the forced drafting of Ukrainian men, the forced conscription, the kidnapping, because that's something the Ukrainian civilians and the citizens are not allowed to protest against. They aren't allowed to protest, for example, against the recent decriminalization of pornography in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. They're not allowed to protest against the corruption, but they are allowed to protest against the resignation of a defense minister who was like part of Zelensky's crew from the very beginning anyway, and most likely apparently he's being offered, at least this is a rumor, Zelensky's just going to make him an advisor to his presidency anyway, so the Mikhailo Fyodorov is going to remain within the Zelensky administration. So the whole thing is a big nothing burger, speculative issue, and at this point I think Ukraine somewhat trying to expand the conflict into the entire area of European Russia, into the Black Sea, into the Azov Sea. I think they're almost trying to, maybe again forcibly trying to have Turkey, these other NATO states like Romania, those countries which have Black Sea ports, to become involved in the conflict, because who knows, there may be Turkish vessels struck in the near future. There may be Russian ships, again, on fire, docking in Turkish ports. There may be all kinds of misunderstandings between these various countries, which could lead then cascade into the conflict further ensuing. And again, maybe even, look, hypothetically speaking, even somebody like Hakan Fidan arriving in Kiev, and I don't want to make this and it's not my position entirely, but perhaps like the idea of diplomats or foreign politicians arriving in Kiev and maybe not being as safe as they suppose they were in previous years. Lindsey Graham, touring the drone factories and then dying mysteriously, literally the next day, and his body arriving in the United States and then being cremated all of a sudden, and all of these other things. Who knows what might happen to somebody like a Hakan Fidan or other Turkish diplomats or those arriving in Kiev. The entire thing is in a situation of flux, but the bloodshed is still continuing. And there was recently, very curiously, again, this points towards who exactly is winning on the ground. There was an exchange of bodies between Russia and Ukraine, and the ratios are truly surprising. It was something like 501 bodies of Russians that the Ukrainians gave back to the Russian side for 31 bodies of Ukrainians. Oh, sorry. There was something like the Russia providing Kiev 501 bodies of Ukrainian personnel who died, and Kiev returning 31 bodies of Russians. So you can see the ratio difference is, again, insane. There's no accounting for why exactly that is the case, except for that Ukraine is continuing to send in waves of basically manpower into the slaughter against their own brothers in this conflict. So the brothers' war well and truly continues, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there will be an end to this war, Conrad, and there will be any ceasefire negotiations until those key cities are taken in the Donetsk People's Republic Oblast. I say this because this week there was a fresh wave of bombing over areas which you, Conrad, traveled in. Gorlovka, for example, there was 2 people killed in a Ukrainian drone bombing. There was bombings happening all over Donetsk again. The flames of the Donetsk is once again attacked. And this is like almost after a year of basically having clear skies and having more or less being protected by the Russians pushing the front line out. And yet, unfortunately, the Ukrainians are basically saying, look, long-suffering Donetsk, here we are, we're back again. It's very reminiscent of the dormitory shooting that happened in Lugansk when the Ukrainians fired several drones at that particular location and basically triple, quadruple tapped and killed all of those innocent children and teenagers. So again, the war in Ukraine and Russia is quite severe and doesn't seem like peace is anywhere near to being resolved. In fact, the conflict more or less is going to push outwards in an exponential way, and potentially even to the south, now that the Black Sea is well and truly involved. And we just have to ask the big question, when is the Russian Black Sea Fleet going to re-engage with the Ukrainians? When will it be ready? When will it leave those secretive ports on the east coast of the Black Sea and actually, again, begin to target Ukrainian sites? We know the American Navy is well and truly active in the Sea of Arabia. They do have anti-drone technology built into them on the destroyers, on the aircraft carriers. They're actually not as afraid, it seems, of the Iranian drones as the Russian Black Sea Fleet is afraid of the Ukrainian drones. So perhaps very, very soon, it's been about 2 years since we saw anything of the Black Sea Fleet. Maybe soon it will become engaged, and perhaps we'll see a full-on blockade of those Black Sea ports on the Ukrainian side. And perhaps then Ukraine will be well and truly brought to its knees on a sort of final basis, or at least brought to the negotiating table.
That's a really good analysis of where things could go, because imagine the Russians blockade Ukraine, they blockade the ports of Odessa, the ports of Nikolaev completely. And so then, imagine there's chaos in Turkey, or it's right before something happens. The U.S. just pressures Turkey. Okay, well, Russia's blockading Ukraine. We need to blockade Russia. Bosphorus Dardanelles Straits get closed. Or maybe the Russians decide, oh, the Black Sea Fleet, we need to escort our tankers through the Bosphorus Dardanelles Straits. And the Turks are like, nope, only civilian commercial vehicles. We're not letting military through. And then there's an escalation in that regard. There's all sorts of ways to game this out. And people need to remember, it was Turkey and their Bayraktar drones that first put Ukraine in the game of drones, in responding to the Russian Iranian drones. Those were the first two drone types that faced off against each other. It was the early Jaran drones from Iran and the early Bayraktars from Turkey and Ukraine. So Turkey sided with Ukraine in the early drone days. We remember all the comments about Crimea that still continue to this day about the Tatars and all this nonsense. And of course, Hakan Fidan today pledging basically their loyalty to Ukraine when it comes to shipping and warfare on the Black Sea, which perfectly sets the stage for the prophesied closure of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits. So we're obviously going to be covering that specific element of this pretty much every week, I'm sure, going forward. But as far as the dismissal of the Defense Minister Fedorov, a correspondent for the Financial Times, Christopher Miller, he said this. He was reporting, some MPs in Zelensky's ruling party who I've spoken to this morning say the mood in parliament is explosive, and some lawmakers are considering not voting for Igor Klimenko, the president's candidate to be the Ukraine's new defense minister. He may not even have enough votes to be appointed, is what I'm told. And of course, the deputy commander of the Ukrainian Armed Air Force, Pavel Yelizarov, resigned from his post, stating he no longer wishes to serve in the Ukrainian military following the dismissal of Mikhail Fedorov from the defense ministry. Yelizarov says Fedorov's reforms saved countless lives, and his dismissal will lead to countless deaths. And of course, Dmitri, you mentioned the beef between him and Syrskyi, and clearly Syrskyi had more clout and won out, as he, of course, actually commands troops, whereas this guy was, one of, 3 or 4 at this point who had only been in there for 6 months. But in the midst of all of this, almost unanimously, the Ukrainian parliament appointed Sergei Koretsky, the current CEO of Naftogaz, Ukraine's state and oil and gas company, as the new prime minister. Koretsky is viewed as fully obedient to President Vladimir Zelensky. So the situation in Ukraine obviously is escalating. But speaking of those potential blockades on Odessa and Nikolaev, I think we are very much moving in that direction. This is from the Financial Times as well. It said Ukraine is struggling to ship grain via the Black Sea as Moscow steps up strikes on commercial vessels in retaliation for a week of heavy attacks by Ukraine on Russian shipping. Russian drone attacks on the port of Odessa, Ukraine's biggest seaport, have caused storage capacity to drop by a third, according to maritime security company Ambry. While ship owners are refusing to send ships into the area for fear of being struck, some traders have paused buying in Odessa, according to analysts. As a result, she said domestic purchase prices at Ukrainian ports have vanished and ship owners are no longer providing freight quotes. Some ships have paused outside Ukrainian waters to reassess the risk of Russian drone and missile attacks, while insurance premiums have soared, according to Pavel Sosnovsky, analyst at Ukraine-based International Seaborne Market. Several underwriters have suspended war risk cover for voyages to Ukrainian ports altogether. And we remember all the hand-wringing about the grain deal and how that was like one of the key things keeping these Turkey-Ukraine negotiations going. All that is just completely out the window now. So again, This will only expedite fuel shortages as we got the Strait of Hormuz, potentially the Bab-el-Mandeb being closed, and now far less Russian anything coming out of the Sea of Azov. And this will lead to food shortages as well, because Ukraine and Russia, their ports on the sea, on the Black Sea, export some of the most grain in the entire world. So this will only contribute to the unrest, the economic instability, the supply chain issues that are moving forward. But again, the idea of we already are in basically a partial Russian blockade of Odessa, just like Ukraine is engaging in a partial blockade of, Sevastopol and Mariupol and these other areas that have ports and have logistics in the Sea of Azov and whatnot. So it's mutual as far as the Black Sea is concerned, and the Black Sea is becoming a more intensive war zone here. So we're just waiting for that announcement regarding the Straits and the situation, of course, with Erdogan. But many people are talking about, with the Russian strikes on Odessa and Nikolaev, the most we've seen since the beginning of the war, Surovikin has apparently been moved to potentially take over command of the ground operations in Ukraine. And of course, apparently his expertise is special forces. Alexander Mercouris on the Duran was talking about how his sources are explaining to him that Surovikin could be being moved into command to, again, begin the crossing of the Dnieper River, potentially the infiltration and strategy behind taking cities like Kherson, Kharkov, and maybe even Odessa, Nikolaev. Again, I have no knowledge about this or evidence. This is just what other analysts are discussing. But again, based on the strikes, based on the escalations in the Black Sea, and again, according to some, based on Surovikin's sort of reshuffling and moving back into command, the situation could be pointing more towards a larger offensive, and Odessa, Nikolaev, Kharkov, these cities very much being on the menu, as it were, as far as becoming part of Russia, or rather returning to Russia. So, Dmitri, I'd love your thoughts on that. I'd love your thoughts. Any more exposition you potentially have, or predictions regarding how Turkey and Russia could be clashing as Turkey moves closer to Ukraine, and of course your thoughts on Surovikin and his kind of movement into power here as Odessa and these other cities come into focus.
It is quite interesting how, as the situation escalates, it turns out that, look, maybe the Russians themselves, some of Gerasimov's statements being inaccurate, the Russian movement forward being extremely slow. A lot of analysts, especially the hawkish ones, saying that Russia needs to do a lot more. And in light of US and Israeli actions in Iran over the last few months, they've sort of shown exactly what is possible in terms of taking out logistical lines, taking out, railways, bridges, taking out port cities, etc. It really shows what the modern military capacity can provide. And if the Russian military is truly the second largest in the world and second most equipped and trained, and perhaps with the most military experience, even more than that of the US, why is Russia exactly holding back? And a lot of people saying maybe it's a leadership problem, right? It's a leadership question. And somebody like Surovikin, I do have to, as a disclaimer, like before anyone gets surprised, Surovikin is Jewish by ethnicity, even though he may be a practicing Orthodox Christian. His wife is an Ashkenazi as well. This is like well known. Even I remember early on in 2022, there was actual Ukrainian media figures and geopolitical analysts within Ukraine complaining, like, why is this Jewish general fighting against us? He's a bad, he's a bad Ashkenazi, he's a bad boy. And they were actually critiquing him for taking the side of Russia. And like Surovikin, however, like he has a pristine record of military service within Russia. He is perhaps, I believe, the longest commanding officer from the Russian expedition, the leader of the Russian expedition in Syria. So in fact, the Russian military during its station in Syria was rotating commanding officers constantly, I suppose, to give them that military experience. And Surovikin had the longest time being in command, helping Bashar al-Assad, helping Hezbollah fight against ISIS, things like this. So Surovikin has also collaborated with many, shall we say, non-linear forces. And also he had that experience working together with Yevgeny Prigozhin, Wagner, these essentially paramilitary mercenary factions as well. Remember, he was one of the figures, potentially why he was ousted in the first place. He was one of the figures who actually asked Prigozhin, he said, we are of one blood, we are one nation, do not go against, Shoigu in the Kremlin, stop your offensive in June of 2023. And maybe for that he was taken off of his post as the leading commander of the Russian armed forces. But it is very interesting that he does have this sort of almost pristine high-level expertise in terms of ground forces and warfare, and he has quite a good reputation among the Russian armed forces. So potentially they might be bringing him back simply for, if anything, for at least a morale boost for the Russians, because it does appear that for whatever reason, mobilization doesn't seem to be possible. And look, there is constantly pressure on the Russian civilians, be it by the Ukrainian bombardment, being by the media being shut down, political repressions. Again, the Russian population is under constant pressure. Fertility rates are well and truly like in the dumpster at this point within Russia, to the point where the Bureau of Statistics hasn't published any data on births, marriages, deaths, etc. in, I believe, the last 2 years. So it's very a sort of extreme situation. And even like media-wise, the Google App Store, for example, within Russia has completely removed Vkontakte, VK, and Max, and removed all these Russian apps that they can use, so Russians can't be using Android phones anymore. There's all these basically restrictions on the regular Russian life that may, again, cause a certain stress within Russian society, and they do need some at least reprieve, and perhaps that reprieve can come from really determinative, again, as you said, Conrad, amphibious operations, the Black Sea Fleet becoming involved, the taking of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, obviously Drushkovka, and all of this perhaps happening at the same time can throw the Ukrainian defensive structure into disarray, especially if it's a combined action similar to what perhaps Trump is planning against Iran, maybe using the Kurds at the same time as a drop-off into the south of Iran, Bandar Abbas, and these amphibious airborne operations. So perhaps a joint sort of assault, a two-pronged action against the potential enemy is what the Russians are essentially going to be engaging in. And maybe this is for the first time where Belarus gets involved as well, because we know Zelensky, for whatever reason, has been incredibly anxious about Batska Lukashenko becoming involved, although there's been no real official statements by Lukashenko being hawkish at all. So perhaps Zelensky is receiving that sort of SBU spy information from within Belarus that, look, maybe something large is being planned over the horizon. So in fact, people are becoming quite wary of the war. They're very tired, and perhaps it is time for some new blood to come into command, and maybe old blood even to return to leadership. So I think in some ways, despite Surovikin's short time as the leader of the Russian armed forces, only for, I believe, from the beginnings of this podcast until the Prigozhin revolt, it does seem like something like that might actually boost the morale of the Russian armed forces, both in reserve. Those, the Russians do have reserves of 1 to 1.25 million waiting in the back. There's a whole second active army of at least 300,000. We know the Russians are preparing for some sort of second wave of attack, or maybe even a defensive formation of some sort that they've shown us last year. And there's of course the active army in the special military operations zone of roughly 700, 800,000 troops total. So the Russians they just need proper command, and I think they'll be reaching those goals very, very soon. And new deadlines would mean, new objectives, and perhaps this is what will bring the Zelensky government finally, despite all the funding that they're receiving, all the Gripen F-16 planes that promised. Sweden has now promised Gripen planes by 2029. This is assuming Ukraine will be still standing by that time. Again, the shortage of Patriot missiles. I think the Russians are looking at potentially heading into a winter of many successes on the front lines very soon.
Oh yeah, it was some good analysis there. Again, we can hope that the Russians have something bigger planned here. And again, the wishful thinking from certain people who, again, are connected well with Russia. I think, the Duran in many ways communicates what a lot of people in the Kremlin, I think, even want to communicate. So hopefully, I think Odessa is on the menu. We've been saying it's on the menu since the very beginning of the show. But like we've also been saying to the beginning of the show, Russia will likely be forced into these situations. And maybe even if Russia has decided to take these cities, the Ukraine war will not be ended at any kind of negotiations or even any kind of mediated fighting settlement on its own, because Russia will be dragged into other conflicts in the Middle East, in Syria, against Turkey, of course, well before I think anything in Ukraine will really come to a conclusion there. So that's my perspective. But talking briefly about the United States before we move on to some church news and some final discussions of what went on the past week, we had a sort of big story here, and that's that 103 Democrats, along with Thomas Massie, voted to cut off aid to Israel. 10 Democrats voted present. So the majority or almost the majority of House Democrats, nearly half, voted to cut off aid to Israel on Wednesday, underscoring a seismic shift in political support for the longtime U.S. ally. This is from Politico. The amendment to a State Department spending bill would have eliminated $3.3 billion in funding. Thanks to strong Republican support for the Jewish state, it failed 314 to 104. But the vote served as a moment of reckoning for House Democrats who have had to confront years of voter outrage about Israel's handling of the war in Gaza. There's also a real sense that the status quo cannot continue. The House number 2 Democrat Rep. Catherine Clark of Massachusetts said in an interview before voting for the amendment, So again, powerful Democrats, second Democrat, the House whip, where the Democrats voted for this. The vote came after months of contentious primary elections where progressive candidates toppled incumbent after incumbent by publicly eschewing spending from pro-Israel groups and promising to recast America's relationship with the nation. Just over 2 years ago, only 37 House Democrats, mostly on the party's hard left flank, voted for a similar bill to crack down on U.S. aid for Israel. This time, a much broader swath of Democrats came along, 103 of the 211 members voting Wednesday, plus another 10 who voted present. Again, not the Speaker of the House, not some other high level, but the number 2 Democrat did do this. And again, many people have pointed this out, but this was basically the chance for a lot of Democrats, more progressive ones that want to be more consistent on their principles. It gives them sort of a free vote to voice their criticism of Israel when they knew this wouldn't pass. They knew every Republican was going to go against it besides Thomas Massie. So kind of a free vote where, the Israel lobby can be like, all right, we gave you that one for free. And fundamentally, it had no consequences. So we'll give you that. It doesn't necessarily, again, would they all have voted for that if somehow there were 100 Republicans that would have also voted for it, and reduced the vote to something that was really close? No, a lot more of those Democrats would have faced pressure in their district and pressure from their, as Thomas Massie said, their AIPAC guy that they most likely have to not vote for that. And in the midst of all of this, of course, J.D. Vance, who is the biggest political victim of the collapse of the Memorandum of Understanding, he went on Joe Rogan, and he's very deftly trying to walk this tightrope where he calls out Israeli influence, because undoubtedly he needs to call it out, or else he's going to be holding the bag. And like, well, why did your Memorandum of Understanding fail? And he's like, because Israel and the Jewish lobby in America made it fail and wanted it to fail. But of course, he can't say that. And so, of course, he asked about the Israeli government influence operations on the U.S. J.D. Vance says, I don't even mind it, adding, foreign governments try to influence the United States all the time. Israel does it. Other countries do it. It's just sort of the nature of the beast. And so Ken Klippenstein said, what kind of vice president is unbothered by the fact that a foreign country interferes in its internal affairs to steer foreign policy in the interest of the aforementioned foreign country? Normally, sovereign countries do not tolerate foreign interference in their internal affairs. So again, he pointed out, and I don't know if you call it dog whistling, but he's obviously pointing out that he's aware of Israeli influence, but he doesn't condemn it. So he's sort of, making it clear that he's aware of it, trying to shift the blame in some capacity. And I think I agree with Nick Fuentes on this, he's sort of getting the worst of both worlds. He's not actually criticizing or condemning Israel. He's not moving the conversation forward. He's not drawing a line in the sand and saying, no, we're done with this Jewish nonsense. He's basically just drawing attention to it, get the ire of the Mark Levins and the Jewish media and the Jewish lobby in America, because he's, bringing them unwanted attention and ostensibly blaming them. But again, he's not making any substantial criticism. So he's getting all of the negative benefits of calling out Israel while not actually calling out Israel. So that's a sort of a very unfortunate development in that specific regard. And just this past week, of course, we not only celebrated the 108th anniversary of the Tsar's assassination. It was also, 972 years since the Great Schism was on July 16th. And it sort of got me thinking about, these two dates and how, basically around the same day, hundreds of years apart, the Great Schism occurred, which, the West sort of was then cleaved away from Orthodoxy. And then when the Jews killed Tsar Nicholas and his family 108 years ago, Orthodoxy was sort of removed from the head of Orthodoxy in that regard was removed. The Cathecon was removed, and we entered into this era of chaos, and the West could fully be utilized as this golem for world Jewry, specifically in the Middle East, because of course the Russian Empire was present in the Middle East to counter a lot of Western influence, of course, in the Levant, in Palestine itself, with Israel being established. If the Russian Empire existed, we've discussed on the show many times how there's no way that a Zionist entity in Palestine would have been able to emerge. There's so many other ways that we've talked about this, but I think it's just interesting that those dates line up. Of course, the feast day of St. Paisios was this past week as well, so very eventful set of dates. And then, of course, Tisha B'av coming up just after the feast of St. Elias, the dog days of summer, July, undoubtedly a very eventful month for, the course of world events, for prophetic events, fateful events that I guess were seen by the prophets. But before we move on to some church news, Dmitri, I'd love your thoughts on that, as well as the situation here in the United States with J.D. Vance and all of this about the Democrats voting against Israel, or anything else. Of course, across the country, there's a lot of natural disasters. We have the Canadian wildfires up in Thunder Bay and in Ontario, just completely dumping the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic and the Great Lakes region, the Midwest of the U.S., completely dousing them in smoke. There's low visibility everywhere. Here in central Texas, we're getting pretty crazy flooding. Of course, there's some other pretty interesting weather phenomenon going on around the place. So some of the prophecies about the natural disasters, I think, are currently being fulfilled. And perhaps if more natural disasters expedite coming later this year in the midst of, again, the fuel shortages and these other things that, again, we'll see those words of Eldris Galactia and Elder Ephraim continue to be fulfilled, which I have no doubt that we will see. So your thoughts on all of that, Dmitri?
There's certainly this feeling of essentially foreshadowing, like you feel like something is going to really escalate domestically in North America, certainly. And you do hear it, I think, it's both in terms of domestic and international relations. You hear these sort of foreshadowings of maybe future conflicts. So an example is there's claims ongoing that there are actually, IRGC Iranian-backed drones that were provided to Cuba, for example, and the idea of Marco Rubio, of course, comes up again, this new sort of neocon bad cop figure within U.S. politics. J.D. Vance interview really showed him, he tried to portray himself as this sort of dovish, like pro-negotiations person within the Trump administration, the vice president, essentially. And he also tried to adamantly say that he was behind Trump's moves, and he said that, look, I'm pro-negotiations, but again, Trump had to make these sort of calculated decisions, and I stand behind the president all the way. And you have Marco Rubio sort of counter-signaling the whole ICC, of course, issue with Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, saying that, look, the U.S. is going to move to dismantle the International Criminal Court. What exactly does that mean, of course? Sadly, the Russian reaction to this isn't going to be any different because, well, look, the Russian Federation, Israel, and the US are completely united on the idea that the International Criminal Court is completely illegitimate and needs to be dismantled. So it's quite sad because there are the arrest warrants for both Putin and Netanyahu actually are still outstanding. So it's quite interesting. So in fact, Putin, Medvedev, etc., they'd probably agree with Marco Rubio and Netanyahu here. So one thing that at least unites all of these great political figures, I suppose great in parentheses again, and it's just quite serious. And again, you have Stephen Miller talking about left-wing terrorism that needs to be struck down in the U.S. You have the Tyler Robinson trial ongoing, all the hysteria around that, the sort of the heritage of the killing of Charlie Kirk and the issue of left-wing mass shooters in America that needs to be sort of addressed, left-wing hysterics. Again, all these problems are going to come to a close, I think, very, very soon. And the midterms are coming up, so we'll exactly see what the American public will be voting on. And Trump's recent address this week being entirely about the fact that the Chinese are meddling in U.S. elections, the fact that, yep, I think all of these are big foreshadowings of some massive domestic changes, be it around the midterms. We're not sure what Trump was alluding to because that was quite a big conversation he had and a big announcement, but what objectives people were, speculating, or is this about him running again because his previous election was stolen from him? Is this an attempt to go for 3 terms, or is this, for example, him preparing the Republicans for some sort of anticipation of the midterms being, for example, deemed illegitimate because the Democrats will be winning too many seats, and that's because of Chinese interference? Who knows exactly? But it's all very curious. The timing, I think, is incredibly uncanny, and unfortunately, with used to the US well and truly sort of subjugated to this sort of international globalist interest and still pushing that agenda forward. I think the saddest thing to see is that these so-called alleged Christians, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, is Roman Catholics, right? The more traditional Christians are well and truly the same type of Christians are, of course, as Pope Leo, who promotes mass immigration into America and other places. Like, these are not your Orthodox Christians. These aren't even SSPXs. So the fact that Christianity is still being used as like a guise of pushing this negative foreign policy by America, be it in the Middle East, and Pete Hegseth being the most egregious example of that, like a Protestant applying Roman Catholic crusader tattoos to himself, and then, saying this whole hoorah, we're going to take the Middle East. It's completely comical. I think it's egregious.
No, 100%. And, you mentioned the Catholic faith of Rubio and Vance, and a lot of the prophecies, San Paisio says that the Pope will be responsible for a lot of this, and that a lot of the after the Russia-Turkey war starts, there will be sort of a neo-crusade from the NATO states to Constantinople, to the Levant, to Turkey, to seize this territory. And the prophecies say that there will be no GPS, there will be no cell service or electricity, or potentially even or at least long-range cell service in Greece, around Athens and these other places, and that these NATO troops will be marching through, and they'll be asking the Greeks and potentially torturing them, apparently asking them how to get to Constantinople. But St. Cosmas of Aetolia said don't tell them, you have to tell them the wrong way to go. It'll be, because again, they won't know the right direction. So, you're supposed to deceive them, I guess. So very, very, I have it right here. It says, they will ask you if the city is far. Do not tell the truth because they will harm you. So that's what St. Cosmas of Aetolia said about it. But again, we see the conditions for all of this being met again very closely. And I'm glad you mentioned the Cuba situation, Dmitri. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said the U.S.'s 60-plus year blockade and illicit sanctions have brought profound suffering to the people of Cuba. The U.S. needs to stop its blockade, coercion, and pressure against Cuba at once. China firmly supports Cuba in defending national sovereignty and standing firm against external interference. And again, we heard the saber rattling and, the setting of a casus belli from Marco Rubio about, we're going to go in there if they have Iranian drones on Cuba to go against us. And again, Marco Rubio himself was undermining the memorandum of understanding to try to get a political, one-up on Vance. Ben Shapiro was going out against Vance for his, conspiracy nonsense on Joe Rogan this week. So Miriam Adelson, Tim Mellon, all these big Jewish donors, and Ben Shapiro, they're all coalescing behind Rubio for 2028. And yet, Dmitri, you mentioned all this talk about China from Donald Trump. At the very least, they're rattling the saber against China so that if China maybe decides to do anything in Iran, they've already riled up people more so against China on elections and all this other kind of stuff. And again, maybe if we are in a conflict against China, Trump will try to use that to extend his reign or extend, some kind of emergency powers amidst elections or something like that. So all sorts of possibilities here. And of course, the Chinese are going to be a key player when this war and the real worldwide nature of World War III really shows itself. But I wanted to read this story, which of course undoubtedly has to do with our coverage of the Russia-Turkey war. It says here, Istanbul police detain Russian couple for reading the Bible in the Hagia Sophia. Russian couple detained for reading the Bible. According to Ostrozhno Novosti, the couple, 35-year-old Victoria and 32-year-old Igor, arrived in Turkey from Moscow for a vacation on the evening of July 13th. Yesterday, on July 14th, the couple visited the Hagia Sophia, one of Constantinople's main attractions. There, the man took out a Bible he brought with him. Igor told Ostrozhno Novosti that after this, the couple was immediately surrounded and taken down out of the Hagia Sophia. The Russians were taken to a police station in the Faith Fatih district. According to the police report, the couple are suspected of violating Article 216 of the Turkish Criminal Code, inciting hatred or hostility among the population, or degrading a section of the public. According to Igor, law enforcement officials are deciding whether to keep the couple in custody or send them to a deportation center. We are not allowed to return to the hotel. They took my shoelaces, and they want to take fingerprints. They said that our fate will be decided here. There's not a single person here who speaks Russian, Igor said. The couple is asking for help from Russian diplomats. Hagia Sophia was built in the 6th century as a Christian church. Following the fall of Constantinople in 1453, it was converted into a mosque. In 1934, the building was designated a museum, but in 2020, the Turkish authorities, in a provocative move, reopened it for Muslim worship. So, Dmitri, I'd love your thoughts on that before we move on to other church news.
How relevant is that to everything we were just talking about? I mean, coincidentally, in this Russian couple, presumably they were just doing this out of their Orthodox Christian faith, and they may have been new converts, they may have been, of course, cradle Orthodox Christians, and it's not exactly clear, but it does seem like they've struck upon something that, look, the Turks, the regime of Erdogan, the attitude towards the Hagia Sophia still remains, look, this is their occupied territory. You're not allowed to pray or read or offend any sort of religious Muslims, and who knows exactly where all of that will escalate. I'll just leave one example for you. After the Greek Revolution in the early 19th century, what exactly happened to all the mosques in mainland Greece, that were built by the Ottoman occupiers? I don't think I need to explain what exactly happened to them, but and most likely the same fate will befall a lot of the locations that the Greeks will liberate, no doubt, with the assistance of the Russians in these forthcoming events in, again, these ancient territories belonging to the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire. So, again, as scary as they may be when they actually do take place, with the rivers of blood and so forth and so on. In relation to the Russo-Ukrainian war, there's been, of course, quite a big story. There's been a very thorough video released by probably the most pronounced Orthodox Christian journalist within Ukraine, or he's a member of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Jan Taksur, and he released this video basically explaining that, unfortunately, the canonical church in Ukraine, these are his fears. He's relayed them to literally Orthodox Christians on Spas TV, hierarchs, laypersons. He's basically been signaling that people like Archbishop Sylvester, people like Metropolitan Agafangel of Odessa, these key hierarchs within the canonical Church of Ukraine have been pushing for, essentially, maybe covertly so, for an autocephalous declaration by Metropolitan Dmitri. And yes, you're going to have Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye, you're going to have Metropolitan Feodosy of Cherkasy, maybe even Metropolitan Longin of Banshen, for example, monastery in the west of Ukraine. You're going to have them opposed, but maybe a good portion of the hierarchs, unfortunately, of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in order to prevent further escalations or persecutions against themselves, will declare a complete rift and autocephaly, complete autonomy from the Moscow Patriarchate. And that declaration, he fears, will be made somewhere in the near future. And that's quite telling. Jan Daksur is probably the most, he even spent time in prison, I believe, at the beginning of the special military operation. So this is not somebody who is a complete speculator or like a hype monger. He pretty much speaks facts, and it's quite scary. And I think that maybe this is why the persecution has been somewhat incremental against the church in Ukraine, almost forcing it to give the hierarchs that opportunity to make a horrendous mistake of announcing an illegitimate autocephalous move, which again would bring a huge rift between Patriarch Kirill, Metropolitan Dmitry, and it could only be healed again by Russians liberating all of those territories, I think, unfortunately. And sadly, there's more news coming out of Kiev, which is quite very queer, I would say. Is you had the lower Kiev caves, those cave systems near the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra where the monastics used to live and all the hermits over the last 1,000 years of Orthodoxy in Kiev, since Saints Anthony and Feodosy of Kiev-Pechersk Monastery. In those caves, there was a huge liturgy celebrated by the Greek Athonite monks, most of them from New Esphigmeno Monastery, and they again celebrated these liturgies in the caves with some of the OCU schismatic priests and monastics, whilst all of the other monks, the 150 monks, the actual legitimate UOC monks, were held under house arrest, still basically under siege in the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, not allowed to participate in the liturgy. So you have basically, and by the way, they're not commemorating Metropolitan Onufri either. They're just carrying out this liturgy commemorating the Ecumenical Patriarch, commemorating Epiphany Domenko Serozha. It's completely profane, and this really shows you that there is a good portion of Athonite monastics who, for whatever reason, be they archimandrites, hieromonks, and very learned, no doubt, in the Orthodox Christian faith, they simply don't understand how schisms work, or perhaps don't understand the ecclesiology, even as some learned laypersons online who you manage to speak to. So this is quite, I think, offensive, especially if you consider that Metropolitan Paul, the actual caretaker of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, has still got an ankle bracelet on and is under house arrest in Kiev outside of his own monastery, and these people don't even commemorate him. And of course, there was no reaction within Kiev and among the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians. This is how pressured they are to the legalization of pornography and the decriminalization of it within Ukraine. There was not a single bishop of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church this week has spoken out against the decision in the Ukrainian parliament, and the fact that degeneracy is now going to be spreading. There'll be a complete, so to speak, a cultural enrichment ongoing, an anti-Christian move among Ukrainian society pushed by Zelensky and his party. And unfortunately, the hierarchs, they feel so bloodied by all the persecution they've been facing that this is just an issue they do not have the energy to face and to actually target and critique. And this really shows you the nature of how persecution can really push you into almost like mental seclusion, where you're just unable to handle more and more issues and address them actually properly. So quite sad.
100%. And it wasn't just the concelebration between the Ecumenist New Esphigmu Brotherhood and the OCU, but at that event at the Kiev Caves Lavra, Epiphany Pupimenko, he called for the Lavra to be rebuilt as what he describes as a prominent pan-Christian shrine. He made the remarks on July 14th during Moleben for Ukraine, held at the Nativity of the Most Holy Theotokos Church within the Lavra. Dumenko characterized the long-standing traditions of the Lavra as the spirit of the Russian world that must be eliminated. The Lavra, which was restored from ruins over the course of 3 decades by the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, has been at the center of an ongoing effort. While his statement comes a week after Maxim Ostapenko, general director of the state-run Kiev Caves Lavra National Preserve, lamented that the presence of Orthodox monks at the monastery hinders tourism there. Ostapenko was also present at the July 14th Moleben. So, again, Domenko, who in the past has said we need to soften on LGBT issues, we need to turn the Lavra into a pan-Christian shrine. Of course, he's not lobbying against the legalization of pornography. He is a pawn of the New World Order to the highest order, and is a disgrace. And just looking at him, I mean, just the physiognomy, you can tell that he's not a real Orthodox bishop. It's that simple. So got to pray for Ukraine, because unfortunately, like you said, Dmitri, it seems some of these even canonical bishops are more interested in appeasing their persecutors and pushing for autocephaly than really standing up against the degeneracy within their own war-torn society. The only moderately good news here, some Orthodox unity. We did see the Bulgarians basically veto the proposal to include sanctions against Patriarch Kirill during the latest draft of European Union sanctions. They also removed Russian businessman Vagit Alekperov, the founder of the company Lukoil, which I guess it's probably some important economic connection there with Bulgaria. But reports had subsequently emerged suggesting Bulgaria might drop its opposition to the Patriarch Kirill listing, but the Patriarch's name was ultimately removed from the draft. The EU first attempted to sanction Patriarch Kirill in 2022 when Hungary blocked the measure, calling it a matter of religious freedom. The effort was revived this spring after Hungary's new government under Peter Magyar signals a willingness to reverse that position, leading EU officials to add Patriarch Kirill's name to the new draft list. Bulgaria then emerged as a new obstacle to the proposal. Radev noted the historical and canonical bonds between Bulgarian and Russian Orthodox churches. I'm not interested in the Russian Patriarch as an individual. I'm interested in the fact that he's the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, which is Eastern Orthodox, just like our church, he said. So Hungary, they dropped it. They became, they were ready to sanction Russia, but an Orthodox country stepped in and protected Patriarch Kirill from sanctions. So good to see. In theory, I guess Patriarch Kirill can still travel around places and be more free. But my final story here, I have at least, is Jay Dyer's appearance on Tucker Carlson. I hope everyone checked it out. It was really good. He discusses orthodoxy. Really, a lot of Protestants came out of the woodwork seething about it. So, it touched on all the right things. We're here near the end of the show, so you don't need Dmitri and I to litigate the whole show for you. You can just go watch it yourself on Tucker Carlson's X account. Jay's been sharing it everywhere, so you should be able to find it. But great discussions of nominalism, the importance of orthodoxy over other philosophies and worldviews, and of course, all sorts of interesting stuff about Hollywood, global elite, and all of that kind of stuff. So check all of that out. One other story I should have mentioned earlier was also that apparently the Istanbul court has issued an Interpol arrest warrant for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, classifying him as a dangerous criminal for alleged crimes against humanity. So again, another example of Turkey, Istanbul specifically, but Turkey and Turkish society drawing the ire of Israel furthermore. So we can see how, again, this potential clash, I could see Erdogan shot down over Crete, coming back from Libya by some kind of Israeli force. That wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. So all sorts of possibilities there. And, Israel is going to be looking for any excuse to move against Turkey, especially, if something goes down against it. Not that great for the Iranians, or the Iranian situation is somehow wrapped up. But who knows? I mean, Israel loves fighting 7, 8, 9, 10 front wars, apparently. So that's where that could be going. But it's been a long show. Dmitri, do you have any final thoughts, words, stories you want to cover before we land the plane?
Yeah, maybe one last. And again, this is a good story coming out from the Russian Federation. I guess for all Orthodox Christians involved, there was, again, the huge celebratory procession on the Royal Romanov Martyrdom Day, 17th of July, the middle of summer in the Russian Federation. And again, it took place with many hierarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church present. Sadly, not that many hierarchs from other jurisdictions, but there were, for example, and it's quite interesting, the Metropolitan of Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and he seems to arrive at literally every single time this procession is on, so you can see he's a true venerator of the Orthodox Royal Martyrs. He is a Metropolitan Vincent Morar, so he was there, again, as probably the oldest Metropolitan, and there was, of course, the Metropolitan of Yekaterinburg, Yevgeny, and many other hierarchs from all around Russia. I believe Metropolitan, or so to speak, Archbishop Saba was probably there as well. There was many, again, notable figures of the Russian Orthodox world, including, pertinent Russian Orthodox politicians. Leonid Slutsky, the head of the LDPR, the successor to Vladimir Zhirinovsky's party, of course, the right-wing party of Russia. He was participating in that big procession that takes place after the liturgy from Ascension Hill. And then, of course, the procession heads out 21 kilometers, which is like something like 13 miles outside of the city, to Ganyana Yama, where the remains of the Romanovs and their servants were burnt, turned into ash, and again scattered during the Tisha B'av Talmudic ritual, and where no doubt the Tsar and perhaps even the Tsarina were beheaded, and then their heads were then taken probably to Moscow, to some other place. So where all of these events took place 108 years ago, as you said, Conrad, there was a huge Orthodox Christian participation. Everyone was commemorating the royal saints and their servants, and again, it was a huge time of Russian Orthodox Christian unity. Yevgeny Metropolitan Yevgeny was, of course, accommodated, and he was followed by Gabriel Doroshin. There was many other figures, Andrei Afanasyev, and many other people from Spas, Tsargrad. A lot of people from the Orthodox Christian Church were present, and from the laypersons community as well. All the Russian Orthodox nationalists, monarchists, all the right-wingers were there, united in the faith. So there was a great event from the center of Russia in the southern Ural Mountains. So that was quite a big white pill, and I think that was the last, so to speak, good, hopeful story from this week, Conrad.
That is a great white pill, great story to end everything on. I want to encourage everybody to like this episode. Thank you so much for making it to the very end. You patriots are the ones that keep the lights on, here, keeping the view count up. So give us a like, share the episode, whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, X, or of course, the home base that is the Substack. Be sure to give us a like, give us a heart, give us a thumbs up, and let us know in the comments what you think is coming next in World War III, because of course, we want to hear from you guys. So do all of that. Check out the Substack at worldwarnow.co. If you enjoyed this episode, consider supporting us by getting behind the paywall. You, of course, not only support the show and keep the lights on here, but you also get access to all of our Ether Hour episodes, getting close to 130 hours, not hours, 130 episodes, usually 2+ hours. So hundreds and hundreds of hours of premium content, really perennially interesting content. History, we have our 2-part series with Gregory Hears about St. John Vatatzis. We just finished our 3-part series with our friend Alex from the Rasputin Archive, all about the true story of Rasputin, telling the truth. We have recent episodes with Maria Z, all about quantum dot technology and the mark of the beast and the total surveillance state. We have an episode with David Patrick Harry. That was this week's most recent episode, all about transhumanism. And of course, next week we'll have Father Peter Hears on to discuss everything about the prophecies from the latest elders on Mount Athos, who we discussed today. So stay tuned for that, and please consider getting behind the paywall. It really helps us out here. We're trying to kick things into high gear, as it appears that the next few weeks are going to be very consequential as far as the prophecies are concerned. So please consider supporting us, because we take this stuff very seriously and want to get the word out and, contribute to what St. Porphyrios said, which is that the words of Metropolitan Neophytos would spread around the world with the technology of, these latter days, as it were. And we want to contribute to that in whatever small way that we can. So thank you so much again for supporting, and consider supporting at worldwarnow.co. If you want to support us besides just that, go to the Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/worldwarnow to give us any number of donations that you would like. Of course, antelopehillpublishing.com. You can get 10% off everything with code WWN. Be sure to find us on all of the socials. I mentioned all the places you can listen to the podcast earlier. Be sure to follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Follow us on X at World War Now _ and follow me on X at Gnomrad. It's really good. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and the Substack. If you're not subscribed on both, you're not really helping us out. But of course, I want you to keep Dmitri and I in your prayers. It's one of the most important things. I want everyone to stay in repentance, stay in the good graces of the church, confess, receive the Eucharist, and prepare. Again, like I said, potentially get maybe an electric bike and some chargers, get some ways to store and synthesize some fuel, get an RV or something so that you can maybe relocate you and your family for a time to a monastery that's preparing for all of this, because all the monks I know are certainly preparing for shortages, whether it comes to fuel or food and whatnot. So again, stay prayed up, stay attending the services, and of course, keep Dmitri and I in your prayers. So thank you again so much for making it here to the end of the episode. worldwarnow.co is where you can find the rest of everything from us. And with all of that, we will see you on the next one. God bless.